A single stone, weathered by 8 centuries of Norwegian winter, bears a runic inscription describing 30 men lost on an expedition west of Vinland. And to this day, no one has ever confirmed where they were going, or what west of Vinland was even meant to mean. The Kensington runestone, unearthed in Minnesota farmland in 1898, only deepened the puzzle rather than solving it. Why do some historical mysteries refuse to die? Not because historians stopped looking, but because every new clue creates another question. A carved stone leads to an impossible journey. A document contradicts accepted history. An archaeological discovery appears centuries out of place. One by one, you'll encounter 22 mysteries that remain suspended between evidence and speculation. That runestone is only the first. Let's see what else refuses to add up. Douglas County, Minnesota, late autumn 1898. A farmer named Olaf Oman is clearing a stand of poplar trees on his land when he finds one wrapped tightly in the roots of a tree he's uprooting. A flat slab of greywacky stone, roughly 200 pounds, its surface covered in carved runic characters. The tree, by most estimates, was at least decades old. Whatever had been buried beneath it had been there long before Oman's family ever settled that patch of Minnesota prairie. The inscription, once translated, told an extraordinary story. A party of Norwegian and Swedish explorers, 8 Goths and 22 Norwegians, on a journey of exploration from Vinland westward. The text describes camping by 2 skerries one day's journey north of the stone, and returning to find 10 of their men red with blood and dead. AVM, the carving reads, "Save us from evil." The date given, translated from the runic numerals, is 1362. If genuine, the Kensington runestone would rewrite the map of medieval Norse exploration entirely, placing Scandinavian travelers deep in the interior of North America nearly a century before Columbus, and roughly 350 years after the accepted Norse settlements at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland had already been abandoned. It would mean Vinland. The Norse name for the coastal lands their sagas described was not the western edge of their ambition, but merely a waypoint, a place explorers pushed beyond, into a continent whose interior no other confirmed Norse artifact has ever placed them. The trouble is that nothing about the stone's story has ever been fully settled. Runologists examining the inscription in the years following its discovery noted linguistic features that seemed, to some scholars, inconsistent with 14th century runic conventions. Certain letter forms, grammatical constructions, and vocabulary choices that appeared to resemble 19th century Scandinavian dialects more closely than anything documented from medieval sources. This led much of the academic community, particularly in the decades following its discovery, to conclude the stone was very likely a hoax, possibly carved by Oman himself or by someone in the surrounding Scandinavian immigrant community, for reasons ranging from a simple prank to a deliberate act of ethnic pride, staking a claim for Scandinavian precedence in American settlement history. And yet the case has never fully closed. Some later researchers, working with updated knowledge of medieval Scandinavian dialects, particularly those spoken in rural regions less represented in the standardized runic inscriptions historians had used as their comparison baseline, have argued that several of the supposedly anachronistic features may in fact reflect legitimate, if lesser documented, medieval usage. Geological analysis of the stone's weathering patterns has produced its own disputed conclusions, with some researchers arguing the depth of mineral degradation on the carved letters would be difficult to replicate through any deliberate 19th century forgery technique, and others countering that weathering rates are notoriously difficult to date with precision, especially on a stone whose burial conditions before discovery remain only partially documented. No corroborating artifact has ever surfaced to settle the matter definitively. No additional inscription, no verified medieval Norse campsite in the region, no independent record from either side of the Atlantic describing an expedition matching the one the stone describes. The stone remains alone, without context, its claims resting entirely on the interpretation of its own carved surface. What happened to the 10 men the inscription claims were found dead, if they existed at all? Was this genuinely the last written trace of a Norse expedition that pushed further into North America than any confirmed history allows, or the elaborate creation of someone determined to write that history themselves? The stone has kept its silence on the question for over a century, offering no further evidence beyond the words it already carries, and no one has yet found a way to make it say more. Leave the Minnesota prairie behind and the poplar roots that kept their secret for over a century. Travel now across an ocean and back nearly 3,000 years earlier to the eastern Mediterranean, to the carved reliefs on the walls of Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Ramesses III near Luxor, Egypt. Among its inscriptions, dated to around 1175 BC, is a detailed account of a massive naval battle against an enemy the Egyptians called simply the peoples of the sea. The relief shows ships locked in combat, warriors with distinctive feathered headdresses, chaos rendered in stone. It is one of the only detailed visual records we have of a group that, within a generation, helped bring the entire Late Bronze Age collapse crashing down, and whose true origin remains, after more than a century of modern scholarship, genuinely unresolved. The Sea Peoples appear in the historical record almost exclusively through the eyes of those they attacked. Egyptian inscriptions from the reigns of Merneptah and Ramesses III describe repeated invasions by coalitions bearing names like the Peliset, Sheridan, Shekelesh, Denyen, and Weshesh, arriving by sea and by land in the decades surrounding 1200 BC. Hittite records, Ugaritic correspondence, and Mycenaean archaeological evidence all point to the same general period of catastrophic disruption. Cities burned across the eastern Mediterranean, from Hattusa to Ugarit to numerous sites in the Levant. Trade networks that had operated for centuries, collapsing within the span of a few decades. The Sea Peoples are consistently blamed, at least in part, for this devastation. And yet not a single contemporary source, Egyptian or otherwise, ever clearly states where they actually came from. This absence has not stopped nearly 2 centuries of scholarly attempts to fill it. Some of the proposed identifications rest on genuinely compelling linguistic and archaeological threads. The Peliset, for instance, are widely connected by most historians to the Philistines, who settled the coastal Levant not long after the invasions described in Egyptian records, and archaeological evidence from Philistine sites does show material culture with apparent Aegean influences, including pottery styles resembling Mycenaean traditions. The Sheridan have been tentatively linked to Sardinia, partly on the basis of name similarity and partly through certain weapon and armor styles depicted in Egyptian reliefs that some archaeologists have compared to Sardinian Nuragic bronze figures from a somewhat later period. The Shekelesh have been connected, similarly tentatively, to Sicily, but tentatively is doing a great deal of work in each of these cases, and the connections often run backward in troubling ways. Sardinia's most compelling Nuragic evidence, for instance, tends to post-date the Sea Peoples' recorded activity, raising the question of whether the naming similarity actually reflects the reverse migration. Displaced groups settling those islands after their involvement in the Bronze Age collapse, rather than originating there beforehand. If so, the Sea Peoples wouldn't be from Sardinia or Sicily at all. They would have created those places' recorded identities, rather than emerged from them. Other researchers have proposed origins considerably further afield, pointing to the broader instability spreading across the Aegean and Anatolia in this period, including the collapse of Mycenaean palace civilization in Greece itself. Under this reading, the Sea Peoples may not represent a single coherent ethnic group with one homeland at all, but a shifting, opportunistic coalition of displaced populations, refugees, pirates, and mercenaries drawn from multiple collapsing societies across the region, unified only by circumstance and the chaos of an era when climate stress, earthquake damage, and cascading trade network failures were destabilizing nearly every major Bronze Age power simultaneously. This theory has gained considerable traction in recent decades, supported by climatological research suggesting a period of significant drought and agricultural failure across the eastern Mediterranean in the centuries leading up to 1200 BC, a crisis severe enough to plausibly displace large populations and turn former traders, soldiers, or farmers into desperate raiders. Still more speculative proposals have periodically surfaced at the margins of mainstream scholarship, including suggestions connecting various Sea Peoples groups to populations from as far as the Western Mediterranean, the Balkans, or even, in the most fringe interpretations, groups entirely outside the Mediterranean basin altogether. Most of these theories rest on linguistic speculation, difficult to verify given how little is actually known about the languages the Sea Peoples themselves spoke, since no confirmed written record in their own words describing their own origins has ever been recovered. This is perhaps the central and irreducible problem at the heart of the mystery. Every account of the Sea Peoples that survives was written by the civilizations defending against them, describing an enemy in the terms of the victim rather than the terms of the people themselves. No Sea Peoples archive has ever been found. No inscription in their own hand explains who they believed themselves to be or where they believed they had come from. What survives is only the impression they left on stone walls built by people they attacked, and the archaeological wreckage of the civilizations that failed to survive their arrival. Somewhere in the collapsing world of the late Bronze Age, a coalition of seafaring peoples emerged suddenly enough, and violently enough, to help end an entire interconnected civilization spanning the eastern Mediterranean, and then largely vanished back into history just as suddenly, absorbed into the populations of the lands they conquered or settled. Where they began remains an open question no surviving stone has ever definitively answered. What exactly were they running from, or running toward, when they first took to the sea? Among the powers destabilized by whatever combination of forces brought down the Bronze Age world, the Hittite Empire looms largest, a civilization whose capital, Hadusa, was burned and abandoned around 1200 BC, its ruins in central Anatolia extensively excavated and studied for over a century. But Hattusa was not the only Hittite capital. Decades before its fall, one Hittite king built an entirely new one, in a different part of the empire, and gave it a name that survives today only in clay tablets, Tarhuntassa. No archaeologist has ever conclusively found it. The story begins with King Muwatalli II, the Hittite ruler best known for facing Rameses II at the Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BC, one of the largest chariot battles in ancient history. Sometime around this period, Muwatalli made an extraordinary decision. He relocated the Hittite capital away from Hadusa, the empire's traditional seat of power for centuries, to a new city called Tarhuntassa, named for the Hittite storm god. Cuneiform tablets recovered from Hadusa's own archives described this move, along with treaties and administrative documents referencing Tarhuntassa's status as capital, its royal court, and its eventual role in a succession dispute after Muwatalli's death, when the capital was moved back to Hadusa under a subsequent ruler. The city, in other words, is extensively documented in the written record of the very civilization that built it. It simply has never been found. This is a genuinely unusual situation in Near Eastern archaeology. Most lost cities of comparable historical significance are lost specifically because so little was written about them, their existence inferred from scattered references, their locations essentially guesswork built on fragments. Tarhuntassa is different. Hittite scribes described its general geographic region with enough specificity that historians have been able to narrow the search considerably, placing it somewhere in the lower land, a region in south-central Anatolia associated with the classical territory later known as Cilicia, likely near the Seyhan or Goksu river systems. Treaty texts describe its borders relative to other known Hittite territories. Administrative correspondence references its role as an active royal seat, complete with the machinery of a functioning capital city, palace, temple complexes, archives of its own. And yet, despite more than a century of archaeological survey across the proposed search region, no site has been definitively confirmed as Tarhuntassa. Several candidate locations have been proposed over the decades, based on the size, period, and character of ruins found within the plausible search area. Most notably a large ancient settlement near the modern Turkish site of Kızıldağ, and another significant mound complex near the confluence of local river systems that would match the general geography described in Hittite treaty texts. Excavations at these and other candidate sites have produced material consistent with Hittite occupation during the correct general period, but nothing yet recovered, no inscription, no administrative seal, no unambiguous textual reference, has provided the kind of definitive confirmation archaeologists require before attaching a name with confidence to a set of ruins. Why has a city this well documented in writing proven so difficult to locate physically? Part of the answer likely lies in simple geographic bad luck. The proposed search region includes areas that have seen extensive later habitation, agricultural development, and, in some zones, modern urban expansion, all of which can obscure, damage, or bury ancient remains beneath layers of subsequent human activity in ways that make systematic excavation considerably more difficult than in regions that remained comparatively undisturbed, the way Hattus's more remote highland location was. A second complicating possibility involves the city's own relatively short tenure as capital. If Tarhuntassa served as the Hittite Empire's seat of power for only a few decades before the capital returned to Hattusa, the resulting archaeological footprint might simply be thinner, less monumentally developed, and therefore harder to distinguish from other, less significant settlements of the same general period scattered across the same region. A city inhabited continuously for centuries tends to leave a deeper, more identifiable mark than one that flourished briefly and was then absorbed back into a more ordinary regional existence once the royal court departed. More speculative proposals have occasionally suggested that Tarhuntassa's remains may already have been partially excavated at one of the candidate sites or elsewhere, but remain unidentified simply because the specific inscriptional evidence needed to confirm the connection has not yet been recovered. Buried still deeper beneath layers, archaeologists have not yet reached or destroyed entirely by the same catastrophic upheavals that ended the Hittite Empire itself around 1200 BC, in the very period discussed in this investigation's previous chapter concerning the Sea Peoples and the broader Bronze Age collapse. Somewhere in the plains and river valleys of south-central Anatolia, the physical remains of a fully documented Hittite royal capital continue to elude confirmation, their location narrowed by centuries of careful textual analysis, but never quite closed by the spade. The tablets describing Tarhuntassa's palaces, its treaties, its royal succession, survive in painstaking detail. The city they describe does not survive at all, at least not yet, in any form archaeology has been able to definitively name. What remains buried beneath that unidentified ground, and how much closer might researchers already be without knowing it? Roughly 2 centuries after Tarhuntassa's tablets went silent in a different empire's collapse, and worlds away in Central Europe, another capital would vanish just as completely. this time not merely unlocated, but so thoroughly erased that historians cannot even agree on which hilltop it once occupied. Somewhere near the Morava River, in what is now the border region of the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, stood Great Moravia's chief stronghold, likely called Velegrad. Its exact location remains debated. Its sudden near-total collapse around 906 AD remains, in several key respects, even less understood. Great Moravia rose to prominence in the 9th century as the first major Slavic state in Central Europe. Its rulers, particularly Rastislav and later Svatopluk I, presiding over a kingdom substantial enough to request Christian missionaries directly from the Byzantine Empire, resulting in the arrival of Cyril and Methodius around 863 AD, whose missionary work would eventually give rise to the Cyrillic alphabet still used across much of the Slavic world today. At its territorial height under Svatopluk, Great Moravia's influence extended across a significant swath of Central Europe, encompassing parts of modern Czechia, Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, and Austria. Contemporary sources describe a kingdom substantial enough to negotiate as a genuine power with the Carolingian Empire and Byzantium alike. Then, within roughly a single generation of Svatopluk's death in 894 AD, Great Moravia simply stopped appearing in the historical record as a functioning state. By around 906 AD, following a period of internal conflict between Svatopluk's sons and a series of devastating military defeats attributed to invading Hungarian forces, the kingdom's political structure appears to have collapsed entirely. Unlike many comparable medieval state collapses, where a clear final battle, a documented siege, or an identifiable conquering force provides historians with a definitive endpoint, Great Moravia's disappearance is markedly less precise. No single decisive battle is clearly recorded as the kingdom's end. No triumphant conqueror's account describes the sacking of its capital in the kind of detail that would let later historians confirm exactly what happened, or precisely when. This vagueness extends remarkably to the most basic geographic question: where the kingdom's principal stronghold actually stood. Contemporary and near-contemporary sources reference a fortified center called Velegrad, described as Svatopluk's seat of power, but no surviving source pinpoints its location with the kind of precision modern archaeologists require. Multiple candidate sites across the Czech and Slovak border regions have been proposed and extensively excavated over the past century, including significant fortified settlements near Mikulčice and Staré Město in the modern Czech Republic, both of which have produced substantial archaeological evidence of a major political and religious center active during exactly the right period. Extensive fortifications, church foundations, high-status burials, and material culture consistent with a genuine royal capital. Yet no single site has produced the kind of unambiguous inscriptional or documentary confirmation that would allow historians to say, with full certainty, this specific location was Velegrad and nowhere else. The kingdom's rapid collapse has generated its own layered set of competing explanations, none of which fully satisfies every question historians have raised. The most widely accepted mainstream account centers on the Hungarian invasions, describing waves of Magyar warriors moving into the Carpathian Basin during the late 9th and early 10th centuries, exploiting the internal succession conflict between Svatopluk's sons to deliver a series of military defeats severe enough to shatter Great Moravia's political cohesion entirely. Archaeological evidence at several major Moravian sites does show destruction layers consistent with violent conflict during roughly this period, lending reasonable support to this reading. But some historians have questioned whether Hungarian military pressure alone fully accounts for how completely and how quickly the kingdom's administrative and political structures appear to have dissolved, compared to other medieval states that endured severe military defeats without such total institutional collapse. This has led to alternative or supplementary explanations, including the possibility that internal fragmentation, driven by the succession dispute between Svatopluk's sons Moimir II and Svatopluk II, had already critically weakened the kingdom's cohesion before Hungarian forces ever delivered what may have been closer to a finishing blow than a singular cause. Some researchers have additionally pointed to the kingdom's own internal diversity, a state assembled relatively quickly from various Slavic tribal groups under strong central leadership, as inherently more vulnerable to rapid fragmentation once that central leadership faltered, compared to more slowly consolidated medieval states elsewhere in Europe. A smaller number of researchers have raised further, more speculative questions about the scale of destruction itself, noting that the archaeological record at some major Moravian sites shows evidence of decline and abandonment occurring somewhat more gradually than a single catastrophic Hungarian conquest might suggest, potentially indicating a slower, more prolonged unraveling than the traditional historical narrative describes, one in which Hungarian military pressure was a significant contributing factor rather than history's sole and complete explanation. What remains, in the end, is a kingdom substantial enough to reshape the religious and linguistic future of an entire region, whose actual capital city cannot be confirmed with certainty, and whose final years are documented so thinly that historians continue to debate not just why it fell, but how quickly, and by whose hand most decisively. Beneath the fortified earthworks of Mikulčice and Stare Miesto, archaeologists continue their careful work, searching for the inscription, the seal, the single piece of confirming evidence that might finally answer a question this region has carried for over 1,000 years. Where, precisely, did Great Moravia make its final stand? And what actually happened when it did? An inscription. A seal. That is what the archaeologists of Great Moravia are still searching for. The single confirming document that would finally validate everything else already known. Somewhere in the archives of the medieval world, a comparable document is known to have once existed in far greater detail, its contents recorded by contemporaries, its authenticity never seriously disputed in its own time, and yet it, too, has vanished, leaving behind only descriptions of a document nobody alive today has actually seen. The document in question is the correspondence connected to the conversion of the Khazar royal court to Judaism, an event most historians place sometime in the 8th or 9th century AD in the Khazar Khaganate, a powerful and religiously unusual steppe empire that once controlled substantial territory across the Pontic Caspian steppe, spanning parts of what is now southern Russia, Ukraine, and the Caucasus region. The Khazars occupied a genuinely distinctive position in the medieval world, a Turkic steppe power bordering both the Byzantine Empire and the expanding Islamic caliphates, whose ruling elite, according to multiple independent sources, adopted Judaism as the state religion, a conversion without clear parallel among any other major medieval polity of comparable size and power. The most detailed surviving account of this conversion comes from the Khazar correspondence, a set of letters exchanged in the mid-10th century between Hasdai ibn Shaprut, a Jewish statesman serving the Umayyad court in Cordoba, and Joseph, the Khazar king at the time, who described in his reply the story of his ancestors' conversion generations earlier, framed as a response to a debate held before the Khazar court between representatives of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, each attempting to persuade the ruling Khagan of their faith's truth. This correspondence survives today, preserved through medieval Jewish manuscript traditions and considered by most historians a genuine, if narratively stylized, historical source. It is, notably, not the original conversion record itself, but a later royal account of it, written generations after the fact, by the very dynasty whose legitimacy the story was, in part, designed to reinforce. The actual, contemporary documentation of the conversion, whatever official records the Khazar court itself may have produced at the time of the event, has never been found. Some historians researching the period have noted references in other medieval sources discussing the Khazars to fuller court records, administrative documents, or religious texts connected to the conversion that appear to have existed at some point but did not survive into the modern era, lost along with the vast majority of the Khazar Khaganate's own internal documentation following the empire's eventual collapse in the late 10th century, largely under sustained military pressure from the expanding Kievan Rus. This loss is not, on its own, especially unusual. The medieval world lost enormous quantities of documentation from societies far better preserved in the archaeological and written record than the Khazars, whose material culture and internal administrative history remain comparatively thin, even where their political and religious significance is well attested by outside observers. What makes the Khazar case draw particular scholarly attention is the combination of an extraordinarily unusual historical claim: a major steppe empire's ruling class adopting Judaism, with source material thin enough that some 19th and 20th century historians occasionally questioned the conversion's scale and sincerity altogether, wondering whether it represented a genuine, wide-reaching religious shift among the Khazar elite, or a more limited development, confined to the royal family and a small circle of the court, whose significance later sources may have expanded well beyond its original scope. Archaeological evidence bearing directly on the question remains frustratingly sparse. Excavations at sites associated with the Khazar Khaganate have produced some material suggestive of Jewish religious practice, including a small number of graves and artifacts bearing possible Jewish symbolism, but nothing on the scale that would definitively confirm the depth or breadth of Judaism's adoption across Khazar society more broadly, as opposed to concentration within a narrower ruling elite. Some researchers have proposed that further, more conclusive material evidence may still lie unexcavated within the Khaganate's former territory, much of which has seen only partial modern archaeological survey, complicated by the political boundaries and periodic instability of the modern regions where Khazar sites are located. A further, more speculative thread of inquiry has periodically emerged around the question of what specifically prompted the conversion in the first place, given the Khazars' geographic position squeezed between an expanding Christian Byzantine Empire to the west and expanding Islamic powers to the south. Some historians have suggested the adoption of Judaism may have functioned, in part, as a deliberate political strategy, allowing the Khazar court to maintain religious and political independence from both neighboring powers without fully aligning with either one's expansionist religious authority. This reading remains an interpretation of motive rather than a documented fact, since the original court deliberations, whatever they actually contained, were never preserved in any account written at the time they occurred. What survives, then, is a story told secondhand, generations after the events it describes, by a royal court with clear interest in shaping how that story was remembered, and a vast, largely silent territory where the actual contemporary evidence, if any of it survived at all, has never been recovered. Did the Khazar court's conversion unfold anything like the debate Joseph described to Hasdai ibn Shaprut? Or has history simply inherited one dynasty's chosen version of its own origin, with the true record lost somewhere beneath the steppe, still waiting, like so much else in this investigation, for someone to finally dig deep enough to find it? Gold catches torchlight differently than any other metal, a slow, heavy gleam, unmistakable even in near darkness. In 1858, near the Spanish village of Guarazar, that gleam is what led a group of local residents to a hidden votive treasure buried beneath a stone slab in an orchard: golden crowns, crosses, and jeweled offerings, dating to the 7th century, once suspended above the altars of Visigothic Spain. It remains one of the most significant hoards of early medieval gold ever recovered in Europe, and by every account historians have been able to piece together, it represents only a fragment of a far larger treasure that has never been found at all. The Visigothic kingdom controlled the Iberian Peninsula for nearly 3 centuries before its sudden collapse in 711 AD, following the Umayyad invasion that would establish Islamic rule across most of Spain for the following several hundred years. Visigothic kings, particularly during the 6th and 7th centuries, accumulated substantial royal and ecclesiastical treasure, a tradition well documented through surviving votive crowns, contemporary chronicles describing royal wealth, and the significant hoard eventually recovered at Khazar itself, believed to represent votive offerings donated by successive Visigothic monarchs to a royal church near their capital at Toledo. The Khazar hoard alone, though partially damaged and dispersed by the very farmers who discovered it before its historical significance was fully understood, included crowns bearing the names of specific kings, most notably a crown inscribed with the name of King Rekkeswinth, providing rare, direct material confirmation connecting the treasure to known Visigothic rulers. But the Khazar find, extraordinary as it is, does not account for the full scope of wealth historical sources describe the Visigothic monarchy possessing. Contemporary and near-contemporary chronicles, along with later medieval accounts drawing on earlier, now-lost sources, reference a far more extensive royal treasury, including substantial quantities of gold and silver, ceremonial objects, and, in some accounts, treasure connected to the legendary wealth the Visigoths were said to have carried with them from earlier conquests, including a persistent tradition connecting Visigothic royal wealth back to treasure originally taken during the sack of Rome in 410 AD under Alaric I, and further associated, in some accounts, with treasure the Visigoths may have obtained or inherited from Roman Hispania's own accumulated wealth during their centuries of rule over the peninsula. When the Umayyad invasion swept across Spain beginning in 711 AD, the Visigothic kingdom collapsed with remarkable speed, its final king Roderick dying in battle within months of the invasion's start, and the kingdom's political structure disintegrating shortly after. Chronicles describing the conquest, written both by the Umayyad conquerors and later Christian sources, reference the capture of significant royal treasure at Toledo, the Visigothic capital, including a famous account describing a legendary table, said to have belonged to King Solomon and brought west centuries earlier, discovered among the treasures of the Visigothic court. But these same sources, along with the broader historical record of the conquest, leave open the question of whether the entirety of the Visigothic royal treasury was actually captured intact at Toledo, or whether portions of it were removed, hidden, or dispersed in the chaotic final months of the kingdom's collapse, as Visigothic nobles and clergy, aware of the approaching invasion, had every reasonable motive to conceal what wealth they could from a conquering force already known for demanding substantial tribute from defeated territories. This is where the historical record grows genuinely thin, and where much of the modern fascination with the lost Visigothic treasure originates. Some later medieval and early modern sources reference persistent local traditions across various regions of Spain describing hidden Visigothic gold, treasure supposedly concealed by fleeing nobles or clergy in the final chaotic months of 711 and 712 AD, buried in locations that oral tradition, rather than documented record, associates with specific caves, riverbeds, or abandoned religious sites across central and northern Spain. The Khazar hoard itself, discovered accidentally by farmers digging in an orchard with no prior knowledge of what lay beneath, offers tangible proof that such traditions are not purely fanciful. Something was, in fact, deliberately hidden in that specific location, presumably in anticipation of the same invasion these broader legends describe, and it went unrecovered for nearly 12 centuries. Whether other, larger caches await similar rediscovery remains an open question. Archaeologists and treasure researchers continue to debate. Most professional historians and archaeologists treat the more elaborate legends, particularly those involving vast quantities of gold connected to Alaric's sack of Rome 3 centuries earlier, with considerable skepticism, noting the difficulty of tracing continuous, verifiable custody of any specific treasure across 300 years of subsequent Visigothic history, and the tendency of medieval and early modern folklore to attach dramatic backstories to genuinely mysterious archaeological finds. But the underlying, more modest claim that some portion of the Visigothic royal and ecclesiastical treasury was hidden rather than captured during the kingdom's collapse and has never been recovered rests on considerably firmer ground, given the confirmed precedent Khazar itself provides. The orchard near Toledo has already given up one such secret, gleaming and half-forgotten beneath a stone slab for over a millennium. Chronicles describe a kingdom's wealth considerably larger than what that single hoard contained. Somewhere across the hills, riverbeds, and abandoned religious sites of central Spain, does the remainder of that treasure still wait to catch the light again? Or was it recovered, melted, and dispersed centuries ago, its story surviving only as legend long after the gold itself stopped existing in any form history could still trace? Follow the old trade roads west and south from Toledo, past the Guadalquivir Valley, until the land finally runs out at the Strait of Gibraltar, the ancient world's edge, the Pillars of Hercules, beyond which classical geographers long believed nothing but open, endless ocean remained. Yet scattered along the Atlantic coastlines of Iberia, Morocco, and further south still, archaeologists have recovered Phoenician pottery, inscriptions, and settlement remains that suggest ships from a small trading civilization based in modern Lebanon pushed through that strait and out into the Atlantic considerably earlier and considerably further than the historical record can fully confirm. The Phoenicians, a network of city-states centered on the eastern Mediterranean coast including Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, built one of the ancient world's most extensive maritime trading systems beginning around the early 1st millennium BC, establishing colonies across the Mediterranean, most famously Carthage, founded according to tradition around 814 BC. Their skill in shipbuilding and navigation was renowned even among their contemporaries and rivals, including the Greeks and later the Romans, both of whom left behind written references to Phoenician sailors venturing into waters other Mediterranean civilizations avoided. The physical evidence for Phoenician activity along the Atlantic coast of Iberia is well established and largely uncontested, with confirmed Phoenician trading settlements at sites including Cadiz, ancient Gadir, founded, according to Phoenician tradition recorded by later classical authors around 1100 BC, making it, if the traditional date holds, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Western Europe. What remains considerably less settled is how much further south and west Phoenician ships actually traveled beyond this confirmed Atlantic foothold, and how early those more distant voyages may have begun. Classical sources preserve tantalizing but frustratingly vague references to Phoenician exploration far beyond the confirmed archaeological record. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, describes an account, which he explicitly states he does not personally believe but records nonetheless, of Phoenician sailors commissioned by the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II to circumnavigate the entire African continent, sailing south from the Red Sea and eventually returning through the Pillars of Hercules after a voyage lasting several years. Herodotus's skepticism centered specifically on the sailors' claim that, at one point during the voyage, the sun appeared on their right hand rather than their left, a detail modern historians have noted would actually be accurate for a ship crossing the southern hemisphere, and therefore, somewhat paradoxically, the detail Herodotus found least believable is the one many modern scholars consider the strongest evidence the voyage may have genuinely occurred, since it describes an astronomical phenomenon a 5th century Greek historian, writing from a Mediterranean vantage point, would have had no independent way to know was accurate. If this account is genuine, it would place Phoenician sailors circumnavigating Africa entirely, and by extension demonstrate their capability for sustained, long-distance Atlantic and Indian Ocean voyaging. At some point in the late 7th century BC, centuries before any other confirmed circumnavigation of the continent by any civilization. No archaeological evidence directly confirming this specific voyage has ever been recovered, and the claim rests entirely on Herodotus's second-hand account of a story he himself doubted, making it, by any reasonable historical standard, unproven rather than established fact. But the astronomical detail continues to complicate any straightforward dismissal. Beyond this specific disputed account, archaeological and geographic evidence has fueled broader speculation regarding how far along the Atlantic coast of Africa, and potentially across the open Atlantic itself, Phoenician trading networks may have extended. Some researchers have pointed to a Carthaginian account, attributed to a navigator named Hanno, and describing a voyage along the West African coast, possibly reaching as far as modern Cameroon or beyond, as evidence of sustained, serious Phoenician-descended interest in far Atlantic exploration, considerably beyond the well-documented Gibraltar and Iberian coastal trade. The Hanno account survives only in a later Greek translation of the original Punic text, and scholars continue to debate exactly how far south the voyage it describes actually reached, given the difficulty of matching ancient geographic descriptions to specific modern coastlines with full confidence. The most speculative edge of this inquiry involves periodic claims, generally treated with significant skepticism by mainstream archaeology, suggesting Phoenician or Phoenician-descended sailors may have reached considerably further into the Atlantic than the West African coast, including occasional fringe theories proposing pre-Columbian contact with the Americas. These claims typically rest on disputed inscriptions, contested artifact finds, or linguistic speculation that most professional archaeologists and epigraphers do not consider credible evidence, and no confirmed, professionally excavated Phoenician artifact has ever been recovered from the Americas under controlled archaeological conditions. This distinguishes such transatlantic claims meaningfully from the far better supported, if still incompletely mapped, questions regarding Phoenician activity along Africa's Atlantic coastline itself. What the confirmed archaeological record makes clear is that Phoenician sailors possessed the shipbuilding technology, navigational skill, and commercial motivation to push further into unknown waters than most of their Mediterranean contemporaries dared attempt, establishing a confirmed Atlantic presence at Cadiz that predates most other Western European settlements historians can reliably date. How much further those ships actually traveled beyond that confirmed foothold, whether the Necho expedition genuinely circled an entire continent centuries before anyone else, and how far south along Africa's coast Phoenician trading ambition truly reached, remains suspended between a handful of second-hand classical accounts and an archaeological record that has, so far, only confirmed the beginning of a story, whose furthest chapters may still lie unrecovered along coastlines no one has yet thought to search closely enough. Roughly a millennium after Herodotus first doubted a story he couldn't quite dismiss, and thousands of miles east of the Atlantic coastlines just explored, an entirely different empire was unraveling with a completeness that has left historians with barely a name to work from. Sometime in the mid-6th century AD, the Hephthalites, known to Byzantine, Persian, and Indian sources alike as the White Huns, controlled a vast swath of Central Asia stretching across parts of modern Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and northern India. Within a few generations, their kingdom had disintegrated so thoroughly that historians today cannot even agree on where its final capital stood, or precisely how its last rulers met their end. The Hephthalites emerge into the historical record around the 5th century AD, a nomadic or semi-nomadic Central Asian power whose relationship to the Huns who devastated Europe under Attila remains debated. Some historians treat White Huns as largely a Byzantine and Persian label, applied to a distinct Central Asian people with no direct connection to Attila's Huns, beyond superficial similarities noted by contemporary observers, while others argue for genuine, if distant, ethnic or political ties between the groups. What is better documented is the Hephthalites' remarkable rise to regional dominance, defeating the Sasanian Persian Empire in multiple significant conflicts during the late 5th century, including a defeat so severe it reportedly resulted in the death of the Sasanian king Peroz I in battle around 484 AD, and extending their control deep into the Indian subcontinent, where Hephthalite rulers, most notably a king remembered in Indian sources as Mihirakula, are credited with campaigns that severely disrupted the Gupta Empire, one of classical India's most significant political and cultural powers. At their height, the Hephthalites controlled an empire substantial enough to be treated as a major diplomatic and military power by Persia, Byzantium, and the various Indian kingdoms they interacted with, all of which left behind written accounts describing Hephthalite military campaigns, embassies, and, in the case of several Byzantine and Persian sources, physical descriptions of Hephthalite rulers and their court practices. Yet the Hephthalites themselves left behind remarkably little in the way of their own written records. What survives of their history comes almost entirely through the eyes of the very civilizations they fought against or extracted tribute from, a documentary imbalance this investigation has now encountered repeatedly, from the Sea People's Egyptian chroniclers to the Khazar's second-hand royal correspondence. The Hephthalite kingdom's collapse, when it came, unfolded with a speed that has drawn sustained historical attention. Around 557 AD, a coalition between the Sasanian Persian Empire under Khosrow I and the rising Göktürk Khaganate to the north delivered a decisive military defeat to Hephthalite forces, generally identified with a battle fought near Bukhara in modern Uzbekistan, though the precise location and even the exact date remain subjects of ongoing scholarly disagreement, given the fragmentary and sometimes contradictory nature of the Persian, Byzantine, and Chinese sources describing the conflict from their respective distant vantage points. Following this defeat, the unified Hephthalite state appears to fragment rapidly into smaller successor principalities, some continuing to exist in diminished form for decades afterward in regions including modern Afghanistan and parts of northern India, while others seem to vanish from the historical record almost immediately. This is where the mystery deepens considerably. Unlike many comparable steppe empire collapses, where successor states, migrations, or absorption into neighboring powers can be traced with reasonable archaeological and textual confidence, the Hephthalites' final dissolution leaves historians without a clear final chapter. No definitively confirmed capital city has been excavated and conclusively identified as the Hephthalites' primary seat of power in their final years, despite various candidate sites proposed across the region based on fragmentary textual clues and archaeological remains consistent with the correct general period. Chinese sources, including later dynastic histories that documented extensive information about Central Asian polities through diplomatic and trade contact along the Silk Road, provide some of the more detailed surviving accounts of Hephthalite society and geography. Yet, even these accounts grow notably thinner and more contradictory regarding the kingdom's final decades, suggesting that even contemporary observers positioned to know struggled to track exactly what was happening to Hephthalite political structures as they fragmented. Some historians have proposed that Hephthalite successor groups were gradually absorbed into the various Turkic and Iranian populations that came to dominate the region in subsequent centuries, their distinct political and cultural identity dissolving through intermarriage, conquest, and simple demographic absorption rather than through any single dramatic conquest or migration event. Others have pointed to genuinely unresolved questions about Hephthalite language and ethnic origin, noting that without confirmed surviving texts written in a language definitively identified as Hephthalite's own, historians remain uncertain whether the various regional groups described as Hephthalite across Persian, Byzantine, Chinese, and Indian sources even represented a single coherent people at all, as opposed to a shifting political label applied by outside observers to several related but distinct Central Asian groups operating under similar political structures during roughly the same period. What remains, then, is an empire substantial enough to kill a Sasanian emperor in battle and destabilize the Gupta dynasty in India, whose own voice, whose own account of who they were and where they finally went, has never been recovered in any form historians can read. Somewhere across the mountains and river valleys of Central Asia, the last Hephthalite rulers faded from the record their enemies kept so much more carefully than they ever kept their own. Did their kingdom end in a single, unrecorded collapse, or simply dissolve, generation by generation, into peoples whose names we still know today, unaware of the empire folded quietly into their own ancestry? A people known almost entirely through their enemies' records. That was the Hephthalites' quiet tragedy, and it is a pattern this investigation keeps circling back to. Here it resurfaces again, but inverted. A figure who appears vividly, memorably, across multiple ancient traditions, and yet whose own kingdom, whose own name, whose own historical reality remains genuinely unconfirmed. She is known simply as the Queen of Sheba. The Queen of Sheba's story appears most famously in the Hebrew Bible's Book of Kings, which describes her traveling to Jerusalem to test King Solomon's legendary wisdom with difficult questions, arriving with a large retinue and gifts including gold, precious stones, and spices, and departing, according to the text, thoroughly impressed by what she witnessed. The account is brief, only a handful of verses, yet it proved extraordinarily durable, expanding considerably in later Jewish, Christian, and especially Islamic and Ethiopian traditions, each of which developed the story further, adding details, motivations, and, in several traditions, an entire subsequent dynasty claimed to descend from a union between the queen and Solomon. What the biblical text does not provide is a clear geographic or historical anchor. It names her kingdom as Sheba, generally rendered in English as Sheba or Saba, but does not specify where precisely that kingdom stood, leaving the question open for well over 2,000 years of subsequent interpretation, translation, and national claim staking. Two primary candidate regions have dominated serious historical discussion. The first is the Kingdom of Sheba, in what is now Yemen, in the southern Arabian Peninsula, where archaeological and inscriptional evidence confirms the existence of a genuinely significant, wealthy South Arabian civilization, controlling the ancient incense trade routes during roughly the right general period, with monumental architecture, an extensive irrigation system centered on the Marab Dam, and inscriptions written in the Sabaic language that confirm Sheba's existence as a real, powerful, and precisely located ancient kingdom. The second major candidate is Ethiopia, or more broadly, the Horn of Africa, a tradition rooted most extensively in the Ethiopian national epic known as the Kibra Nagast, compiled in something close to its current form around the 14th century AD, but drawing on considerably older oral and written traditions. This account describes the Queen of Sheba, given the name Makeda in Ethiopian tradition, as ruler of Ethiopia, and elaborates significantly on the biblical account, describing her conversion and eventual return to Ethiopia, carrying a son by Solomon, Menelik, who would later travel to Jerusalem and, according to the tradition, return to Ethiopia carrying the Ark of the Covenant itself, an object still claimed today by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church to reside in a guarded chapel in Aksum, viewed by no one except a single appointed guardian monk. Historians examining these two competing traditions face a genuinely difficult evidentiary problem. The Sabaean kingdom in Yemen is the better independently confirmed historical entity, verified through extensive archaeological work and a substantial body of surviving Sabaic inscriptions, but no inscription yet recovered from South Arabia specifically names or clearly references a queen matching the biblical account. Nor does South Arabian evidence confirm female rulership was a standard or even attested practice within Sabaean political structure during the relevant period. A gap some scholars consider a significant complicating factor for the Yemeni identification. The Ethiopian tradition, meanwhile, while considerably richer in narrative detail regarding the queen herself, rests on a written source compiled roughly 2,000 years after the events it describes, drawing on oral tradition whose earlier history cannot be independently verified with anything like the archaeological confidence available for the Sabaean kingdom's basic existence. Further complicating the picture, archaeological and trade evidence indicates that ancient South Arabian and Horn of Africa societies maintained close, sustained contact across the narrow strait separating them, with some historians proposing that ancient Sheba may have encompassed territory and political influence spanning both sides of the Red Sea, rather than existing exclusively within the borders of either modern Yemen or Ethiopia, a reading that would make the historical Sheba less a single fixed nation than a broader cultural and trading zone straddling the strait, of which both the Yemeni and Ethiopian traditions might represent partial, later nationalized inheritances of the same original historical memory. A smaller number of researchers have raised further questions about whether the biblical account itself reflects a genuine 10th century BC diplomatic visit at all, noting that the text's precise composition date remains debated among biblical scholars, with some arguing portions of the Solomon narrative may have been compiled or embellished considerably later than the events they describe, complicating any straightforward attempt to treat the account as a direct, contemporary historical record rather than a later theological and political composition drawing, to an uncertain degree, on older material. What remains after well over 2 millennia of religious tradition, national claim, and modern historical inquiry is a queen who exists vividly in text and cultural memory across 3 major world religions, and who cannot be conclusively placed on any map, confirmed in any inscription bearing her own name, or fixed to any single verified kingdom archaeologists have excavated. Did she rule from the incense terraces of ancient Yemen, from the highlands of Ethiopia, from some territory spanning both, or does she represent a later synthesis of trade, memory, and theology rather than any single historical monarch at all? Every tradition insists she was real. None of them, so far, has been able to prove exactly where. Gold reliquaries, a guarded chapel, an object no living person outside a single monk is permitted to see. That image closed the last chapter, and it finds an odd echo inside Aachen Cathedral in western Germany, where a golden shrine, ornate and gleaming, has stood since the 13th century, said to contain the bones of the man who once ruled nearly all of Western Europe. The shrine itself is not in serious dispute. What lies inside it, and whether it fully accounts for everything that happened to Charlemagne's body across more than 1,000 years of exhumation, relocation, and reverence, is considerably less settled than most visitors are ever told. Charlemagne, crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 800 AD, died in January of 814 at his palace in Aachen, and was, according to contemporary accounts including the biography written by his court scholar Einhard, buried the same day in the palace chapel he had built there, a building that forms the core of what is now Aachen Cathedral. Einhard's account, among the most detailed and historically trusted sources for Charlemagne's life and death, describes the burial in general terms but leaves considerable ambiguity regarding the tomb's exact original form, its precise location within the chapel, and what, if any, specific burial goods or markers originally accompanied the body. What happened next is where the historical record grows genuinely tangled. Various medieval sources describe multiple subsequent openings and relocations of Charlemagne's remains over the following centuries, beginning most notably with an account attributing an opening of the tomb to Emperor Otto III around the year 1000 AD, a date that would place the event roughly 2 centuries after the original burial. Otto III's chroniclers describe finding the body remarkably preserved, seated upright on a throne, an image that has become deeply embedded in popular memory of the event, though modern historians treat the more dramatic details of this account with some caution, given that it survives only through later medieval retellings written well after the fact, in a genre of writing that frequently emphasized miraculous preservation as a marker of sanctity or exceptional status rather than as sober physical reporting. A more thoroughly documented reburial occurred in 1165, when Charlemagne, having been canonized as a saint under the sponsorship of Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, a canonization never formally recognized by the broader Catholic Church, but observed locally for centuries afterward, had his remains transferred into a new, more elaborate shrine. Then, in 1215, under Frederick II, the remains were transferred once more into the golden reliquary shrine that still stands in Aksum Cathedral today, an object extensively studied and dated with confidence to exactly this period. This is where the documented history becomes considerably more solid, and also where the deeper uncertainty actually begins. Modern forensic examination of the remains housed within the Aken Shrine has occurred multiple times over the past century, including a particularly thorough multi-year study conducted by a team of researchers beginning in the 1980s, which examined skeletal remains associated with the shrine using then-current forensic and anthropological techniques. This research concluded that the skeletal remains were broadly consistent with a tall, robust male individual who died at an advanced age for the period, aligning reasonably well with contemporary descriptions of Charlemagne's own physical stature, which Einhard specifically noted as unusually tall. Radiocarbon dating and other analyses have generally supported a burial date consistent with the early 9th century, lending meaningful scientific support to the traditional identification, but broadly consistent and reasonably well are, once again, doing considerable work in this conclusion, and several complicating factors prevent the identification from reaching the kind of certainty a modern forensic case would typically require. Centuries of repeated exhumation, relocation, and, according to some medieval accounts, distribution of specific bones or relics to other churches and rulers as sacred gifts, a well-documented practice for canonized medieval royalty, mean that the remains housed in the current Aken shrine may not represent a single, complete, undisturbed skeleton at all, but rather a composite assembled and reassembled across multiple medieval interventions, potentially incorporating bones from more than one individual, whether through simple error during repeated handling across centuries or through deliberate later additions intended to restore perceived completeness to a relic set that had been partially dispersed. Some researchers involved in more recent forensic work on the remains have specifically noted this composite possibility, suggesting that at least some skeletal elements associated with the shrine may not be fully consistent with the others in terms of age or physical characteristics, raising the quiet possibility that Charlemagne's remains, as currently displayed and revered, may represent the emperor's actual body only in part, mixed at some point across the medieval centuries with other material, whose origin can no longer be confidently traced or separated out with full certainty, using current, still partially destructive, forensic methods. A limitation that has made some custodial religious authorities understandably cautious about permitting more invasive testing that might resolve remaining questions, but would also require disturbing a shrine treated as a sacred object for 8 centuries. There is a further quieter uncertainty involving the original 814 burial itself, before any of the later medieval relocations occurred. Some historians have questioned whether the original tomb, as briefly described by Einhard, may have included additional grave goods, inscriptions, or structural elements that were lost, removed, or simply left undocumented during the earliest recorded exhumation under Otto III. Elements that, had they survived and been properly recorded, might have offered considerably more definitive confirmation of the burial's original context than the skeletal evidence alone can now provide. What stands in Aachen Cathedral today is treated, by long-standing religious tradition and by the balance of available forensic evidence, as the resting place of Charlemagne, and most historians accept this identification as reasonably well supported, if not absolutely forensically airtight in the way a modern criminal investigation would demand. 9 centuries of shifting reliquaries, partial relic distribution, and repeated incompletely documented exhumation stand between the man Einhard described burying in 814 and the Golden Shrine visitors view today. How much of Charlemagne actually remains inside it, undisturbed and fully his own, and how much has quietly become something closer to a composite memorial, assembled by centuries of reverent hands more interested in preserving a symbol than in the kind of precise, individual certainty modern science would require. The shrine keeps its gold locked tightly around whatever answer it still holds. Push the clock back now, well over 1,000 years before Charlemagne's coronation, past even the Sea People's assault on the Bronze Age world explored earlier in this investigation, to a set of cuneiform tablets housed today in the British Museum, recovered from the ruins of Nineveh. Written in the 7th century BC, they record Assyrian spies and officials reporting, with evident alarm, on a people erupting out of the north. Warriors the Assyrians called the Cimmerian, known to later Greek writers as the Cimmerians. Where they came from before that eruption remains one of the oldest unresolved migration mysteries in the historical record. The Cimmerians appear clearly enough once they arrive on the stage of recorded history. Assyrian royal correspondence and annals from the reigns of Sargon II and his successors describe Cimmerian forces moving through Anatolia and the Caucasus region during the 8th and 7th centuries BC, a period of considerable upheaval across the Near East. The Cimmerians are credited, across multiple independent sources including Assyrian records and later Greek historians, with playing a significant role in the destruction of the kingdom of Phrygia, traditionally associated with the legendary King Midas, and with delivering a defeat severe enough to Lydia, another major Anatolian power, that its king, Gyges, died in the fighting around 644 BC, an event referenced independently in both Assyrian records and the later Greek historian Herodotus, lending it unusually solid corroboration for an event this early and this far from the Mediterranean world's own primary historical centers. What none of these contemporary or near-contemporary sources adequately explain is where the Cimmerians actually came from before they began appearing in Near Eastern records. Already in motion, already a military force significant enough to concern the Assyrian Empire, one of the most powerful states in the ancient world at the time. Herodotus, writing considerably later in the 5th century BC, offers an account describing the Cimmerians as an earlier population of the Pontic steppe, the grasslands north of the Black Sea in what is now Ukraine and southern Russia, driven out of their homeland by the arrival of another steppe people, the Scythians, and forced to migrate south and east into Anatolia and the Caucasus as a result. This account has formed the basis for most mainstream historical reconstructions of Cimmerian origins for over 2,000 years. The trouble is that Herodotus's account, while plausible and broadly consistent with what little other evidence exists, was written centuries after the events it describes, drawing on sources and traditions that cannot now be independently verified, and archaeological evidence for a specifically identifiable Cimmerian material culture on the Pontic steppe, prior to their appearance in Near Eastern texts, remains genuinely difficult to isolate with confidence. Archaeologists working in the region have identified various Bronze and early Iron Age cultures across the Pontic steppe during the relevant period, but connecting any specific one of these archaeological cultures definitively to the historical Cimmerians named in Assyrian and Greek sources requires a chain of inference that most careful scholars acknowledge remains genuinely uncertain, resting on geographic plausibility and later Greek tradition rather than direct, confirmed material evidence linking a known steppe culture to the specific name Cimmerian. This uncertainty deepens further when considering the question of Cimmerian language and ethnic identity, a problem this investigation has now encountered repeatedly across multiple ancient peoples. No confirmed text written in a language identified with confidence as Cimmerian's own has ever been recovered. What survives are names, mostly rulers' names, preserved in Assyrian cuneiform transcription, and later Greek renderings of the same or similar names, both filtered through the phonetic conventions and assumptions of outside observers rather than any direct Cimmerian self-record. Linguists have proposed various classifications based on these fragmentary transcribed names, with some scholars arguing for an Iranian language connection, placing the Cimmerians within the broader family of Iranian-speaking steppe peoples that would later include the Scythians and Sarmatians, while others have urged caution given how thin the underlying evidence actually is, noting that a small number of transcribed royal names filtered through two different foreign writing systems provides a genuinely fragile foundation for confident linguistic classification. A further complication involves the relationship between the Cimmerians and the Scythians themselves, the people Herodotus credits with displacing them from the Pontic steppe in the first place. Some historians have questioned whether the sharp displacement narrative Herodotus describes reflects the actual historical process accurately, or whether it may represent a simplified, later Greek understanding imposed on a more complex, gradual process of steppe population movement, cultural interaction, and political realignment that unfolded over a longer period than a single displacement event would suggest. Under this reading, Cimmerian and Scythian may have represented less two entirely distinct, sequentially replacing populations, and more overlapping political or cultural groupings, whose boundaries and self-identifications shifted considerably over the actual span of decades involved. A nuance that later Greek historical tradition, writing from a considerable geographic and temporal remove, may have simplified into the cleaner displacement narrative that became the standard account. There is a further, more speculative thread some researchers have raised regarding possible connections between the Cimmerians and other steppe or Caucasus populations referenced in various ancient sources under different names, raising the question of whether Cimmerian itself functioned, at least in part, as an external label applied somewhat inconsistently by Assyrian and Greek observers to a shifting coalition of steppe and mountain warriors, rather than describing a single, stable, self-identified ethnic group with clear and consistent boundaries across the roughly century and a half during which the name appears in surviving records. What remains, then, is a people who left a genuine, violent mark on the ancient Near East. toppling kingdoms and killing kings in conflicts independently confirmed across multiple contemporary written traditions, and yet whose own origin, own language, and own sense of collective identity survive today only as inference, filtered entirely through the records of the settled, literate civilizations they invaded. The steppe grasslands north of the Black Sea keep whatever fuller history might explain where the Cimmerians actually came from, and archaeology has not yet found the confirming trace that would finally close the distance between Herodotus's second-hand account and the ground itself. Did an entire people simply appear out of the north as suddenly as the Assyrian tablets suggest, or does their true beginning still lie buried somewhere on that steppe, unread and unconnected to the name history gave them? Leave the steppe behind, and the fragmentary cuneiform reports of nervous Assyrian officials, and travel instead to Baghdad, roughly 15 centuries later, to an institution whose own founding records are almost as frustratingly thin as anything this investigation has encountered from the ancient world. Sometime in the early 9th century AD, under the patronage of the Abbasid Caliph al-Mamun, a library and translation institution known as Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, took shape in the Abbasid capital. It would become, by most historical accounts, one of the great intellectual centers of the medieval world. And the earliest chapter of its own history remains, even now, considerably harder to pin down than its later fame would suggest. The House of Wisdom is best documented in its mature form, flourishing across the 9th century as a center for translating Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit, scientific and philosophical texts into Arabic, employing scholars including the mathematician al-Khwarizmi, whose work would eventually give the world the term algorithm, and supporting a broader translation movement that preserved and transmitted enormous quantities of classical knowledge that might otherwise have been lost entirely to the European Middle Ages, later reintroduced to Western Europe centuries afterward, partly through Arabic translations and commentaries produced in exactly this institutional context. This later, well-documented flourishing rests on a reasonably solid foundation of surviving administrative references, scholarly biographies, and the substantial body of translated texts themselves, many of which survive in manuscript form today. The institution's earliest founding, however, is considerably murkier. Later Arabic sources, writing decades or in some cases centuries after the fact, attribute the House of Wisdom's establishment to Caliph al-Ma'mun, who reigned from 813 to 833 AD, describing a formal library and research institution built specifically to house and expand a translation project already underway under his predecessors. But some historians examining the earliest available sources have questioned whether the House of Wisdom, in the grand singular institutional sense later tradition describes, truly began with al-Ma'mun at all, or whether it represents a later formalization and mythologizing of a translation and scholarly effort that had actually been developing more gradually across several earlier Abbasid reigns, including those of al-Mansur and Harun al-Rashid, absorbed retroactively into a single, cleaner founding narrative attached to al-Mamun's more famous patronage. This uncertainty about the institution's precise founding connects to a deeper and more tantalizing question. What exactly was actually housed there in its earliest years before the translation movement reached the scale and documentation of its later, better recorded decades? Later, Arabic bibliographic sources, including the famous 10th century catalog known as the Kitab al-Fihrist, compiled by the bookseller Ibn al-Nadim, reference numerous specific texts translated during the broader Abbasid translation movement, providing historians with a reasonably detailed picture of what scholarly material moved through Baghdad's intellectual institutions during the 9th and 10th centuries. But the Fihrist itself was compiled generations after the House of Wisdom's founding, and its coverage of the institution's earliest years, its very first acquisitions and translation projects, relies on second-hand tradition rather than contemporary institutional record-keeping that has actually survived into the present. Some historians researching the earliest phase of the translation movement have pointed to tantalizing references, scattered across various medieval Arabic sources, to specific early manuscripts, particularly Greek scientific and philosophical texts acquired through diplomatic exchange with the Byzantine Empire, that are named or briefly described in later sources but cannot be definitively traced to any surviving manuscript tradition today. Whether these represent texts that were genuinely translated and then subsequently lost during the later, well-documented disasters that struck Baghdad's libraries, most catastrophically during the Mongol siege of 1258, or whether some of these early references reflect exaggeration, confusion, or retroactive embellishment by later Arabic bibliographers eager to enhance the House of Wisdom's founding prestige, remains a genuinely open question historians continue to debate. The 1258 Mongol destruction of Baghdad looms particularly large over this uncertainty. Contemporary and near-contemporary accounts describe catastrophic destruction of the city's libraries during the siege, including a frequently repeated, though difficult to verify with full precision, tradition claiming that so many books were thrown into the Tigris River that its waters ran black with ink for days afterward. Whatever the precise accuracy of this vivid image, most historians agree the Mongol conquest did result in genuine, severe, and largely irreversible loss of manuscripts held in Baghdad's libraries and institutions, a catastrophe that makes reconstructing the House of Wisdom's complete earlier holdings, particularly from its murkier founding decades, considerably more difficult than it would otherwise be, since whatever documentation might have existed to settle the question was likely destroyed along with the texts themselves. A further complicating and more speculative thread involves persistent, difficult-to-verify traditions describing certain particularly rare or sensitive texts, including some scientific and astrological material, that later sources suggest may have been restricted even within the House of Wisdom's own scholarly community, available only to specific favored scholars or the caliph's own inner circle, rather than freely accessible to the broader translation project. Some researchers have connected this restricted access tradition to broader medieval Islamic scholarly debates regarding the appropriate handling of certain categories of philosophical and scientific knowledge considered potentially sensitive on religious or political grounds. Whether any specific texts genuinely fell under this kind of restricted status, and if so, what exactly they contained, remains almost entirely a matter of later tradition and inference rather than documented certainty, since no confirmed internal catalog or access record from the House of Wisdom's own operation during this period has survived to confirm or deny the practice in any detail. What remains, then, is one of the most historically significant intellectual institutions of the medieval world, whose mature, flourishing decades are documented with reasonable confidence through surviving texts and later bibliographic tradition, and whose earliest years, the actual founding circumstances, the first acquisitions, whatever restricted or since vanished material may have passed through its earliest halls before Baghdad's later catastrophes swept so much of the historical record away entirely, remain considerably less certain than the institution's enduring reputation might suggest. Somewhere between al-Mansur's early patronage and al-Mamun's more celebrated founding, and somewhere beneath the ink-darkened waters the Mongol conquest is said to have left behind, the House of Wisdom's true earliest chapter may simply have been lost before anyone thought to record it as carefully as its later fame would eventually deserve. Ink-blackened water, the Tigris carrying away a library's worth of knowledge, that image closes the last chapter. Follow rivers now to an entirely different setting, across the Indian Ocean to the swampy, waterlogged lowlands of southeastern Sumatra, where another river system, the Musi, is believed to have carried the wealth of a very different kind of capital. The heart of Srivijaya, a maritime empire that dominated Southeast Asian trade for centuries, and whose principal city has never been definitively located on the ground. Srivijaya rose to prominence around the 7th century AD as a major Buddhist maritime and commercial power, controlling the crucial trade routes through the Strait of Malacca, the narrow passage connecting the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea, through which enormous quantities of medieval trade, Chinese silk and ceramics moving west, Indian and Middle Eastern goods moving east, necessarily passed. Contemporary and near-contemporary sources describe Srivijaya as a genuinely major power, substantial enough that the Chinese Buddhist monk Yi Jing, traveling through the region in the late 7th century on his way to study in India, stopped at Srivijaya's capital for an extended period, describing it as a significant center of Buddhist learning housing, over 1,000 monks engaged in a scholarly study comparable, in his account, to major centers in India itself. Chinese dynastic records reference regular diplomatic and tribute missions from Srivijaya across several centuries, confirming the kingdom's sustained importance as a regional power, and several inscriptions, written in Old Malay using a script derived from Indian sources, have been recovered from various sites across Sumatra, providing genuine, if fragmentary, epigraphic evidence for the kingdom's existence, religious character, and political structure. What remains unresolved, despite this reasonably substantial body of textual and epigraphic evidence confirming Srivijaya's existence and importance, is the precise location of its principal capital, the city Yijing actually visited and described in such admiring detail. The most widely accepted candidate location centers on the area around modern Palembang, in southeastern Sumatra along the Musi River, based primarily on the discovery there of several significant Srivijayan inscriptions, including the Kedukan Bukit inscription, dated to 683 AD and considered one of the oldest surviving records of the Malay language, describing what appears to be a military expedition connected to the kingdom's early consolidation of power. This inscriptional evidence, combined with Palembang's strategic position and its continued historical importance as a regional trading center in subsequent centuries, has made it the scholarly consensus location for Srivijaya's capital for the better part of a century. Yet archaeological excavation around Palembang has produced results that some researchers consider frustratingly incomplete relative to the scale of urban sophistication Yi Jing's account and the broader historical record of Srivijayan power would seem to require. Unlike comparable major capitals of contemporary Southeast Asian and South Asian kingdoms, where monumental temple complexes, palace foundations, and substantial urban infrastructure have been extensively excavated and mapped, the Palembang region has yielded a comparatively modest archaeological footprint, given Srivijaya's evident historical significance. A discrepancy some archaeologists attribute to the region's challenging swampy, low-lying terrain, where organic building materials, wood, and other perishable construction common to the tropical environment, rather than the stone monuments favored elsewhere in the region, would have decayed far more completely than stone architecture might have, leaving behind considerably less physical evidence for archaeologists to recover, regardless of how substantial the actual historical settlement once was. This environmental explanation is broadly accepted by most specialists working the region, but it has not entirely settled the question, and a smaller number of researchers have proposed alternative candidate locations for Srivijaya's capital, or at least for certain periods of its multi-century history, including sites further north on Sumatra, and in some more speculative proposals, locations across the strait on the Malay Peninsula itself. Some historians have suggested that Srivijaya's capital may not have remained fixed in a single location throughout its several centuries of documented existence at all. but may have shifted at different points in the kingdom's history, whether due to political upheaval, changing trade route dynamics, or environmental pressures specific to the challenging riverine terrain the kingdom occupied, meaning the search for a single, definitive Srivijayan capital may be looking for a target that itself moved considerably more than the traditional Palembang-centered narrative assumes. Underwater archaeology has added a further, genuinely tantalizing dimension to this ongoing investigation. The waters around Sumatra and the broader Strait of Malacca region have produced significant shipwreck discoveries in recent decades, including vessels carrying cargo consistent with the exact kind of Indian Ocean and South China Sea trade Srivijaya is known to have controlled and profited from, offering material confirmation of the trading networks the kingdom presided over, even where the capital city's own physical remains continue to elude confident excavation. Some researchers have speculated that further underwater or riverine archaeological work, particularly given the Musi River's role in Palembang's ancient waterfront, and the likelihood that portions of the ancient settlement may lie buried beneath river sediment or subsequent urban development in the modern city, could yet reveal considerably more of the original capital's physical extent than surface excavation alone has managed to uncover, though this remains, for now, a hopeful research direction rather than a confirmed archaeological breakthrough. What survives with confidence, then, is a kingdom whose existence, religious significance, and centuries-long commercial dominance over one of the medieval world's most important trade corridors is genuinely well documented, through Chinese records, through a Chinese pilgrim's own admiring first-hand account, and through several inscriptions in the kingdom's own Old Malay language. What remains considerably less certain is the physical reality of the city at the center of it all. The place Yijing actually walked among 1,000 studying monks, whose monumental architecture, if it ever matched the kingdom's evident wealth and importance, has either decayed entirely into Sumatra's tropical soil or still lies waiting beneath river silt or modern urban ground for an excavation precise enough to finally bring it fully back into view. Leave the swampy river capital of Srivijaya behind and travel north and east deep into Tang Dynasty China to the ancient capital of Chang'an, where in 1625 workers digging near the city of Xi'an unearthed a large limestone stele, nearly 3 meters tall, inscribed in both Chinese characters and Syriac script. Dated to 781 AD, it commemorates something almost nobody studying Chinese history at the time expected to find: a flourishing Christian community of the Church of the East tradition, often labeled Nestorian, that had been active in China for well over a century before the stele was carved, and that would, within a few generations of its creation, vanish from the historical record almost entirely. The Xi'an stele, as it has come to be known, describes the arrival of a Christian missionary named Alopen in Chang'an in 635 AD, during the reign of Emperor Taizong, and details subsequent imperial support for the establishment of churches and monasteries across the Tang Empire over the following century and a half. The inscription's account is corroborated by other surviving Tang-era documents, including several Chinese-language Christian texts recovered from the Dunhuang manuscript caves in the early 20th century, texts that blend Christian theology with Chinese philosophical vocabulary and Buddhist and Taoist terminology in ways that reveal a genuinely sophisticated, deliberate effort at cultural and religious translation, rather than a marginal or poorly integrated foreign presence. Together, this evidence confirms that Church of the East Christianity, brought east along Silk Road trade networks from its origins in the Sasanian Persian Empire, and further west, established a genuine, imperially sanctioned religious presence in China lasting from the early 7th century through at least the late 8th century, when the stele itself was carved, and quite possibly longer. And then, within roughly a century after the stele's creation, the archaeological and textual record for this Chinese Christian community grows abruptly and dramatically thin, to the point that, by the time significantly later Chinese sources address the subject at all, the tradition sometimes appears to have been essentially forgotten, requiring later missionaries and historians, including Jesuit scholars arriving in China many centuries afterward, to effectively rediscover the existence of Tang-era Chinese Christianity through finds like the Xi'an stele itself, rather than through any continuous institutional memory connecting the earlier community to later Chinese religious life. The most commonly cited explanation for this apparent collapse centers on a documented historical event: the Huichang persecution of Buddhism, ordered by Emperor Wuzong in 845 AD, a broad suppression targeting what the imperial court characterized as excessive foreign religious influence and economic power accumulated by religious institutions, particularly Buddhist monasteries, but extending, according to surviving Tang records, to other foreign religions active in China at the time, including Zoroastrianism and Church of the East Christianity alongside Buddhism. Imperial edicts from this period describe measures including the closure of religious institutions, forced laicization of clergy, and confiscation of religious property, measures that, if applied with anything like the severity described for Buddhist institutions, would have dealt a genuinely severe blow to a Christian community that, however established, likely remained considerably smaller and less deeply embedded in Chinese society than Buddhism's far more extensive institutional presence by this period. This explanation accounts for a great deal, and most historians accept the Huichang persecution as a significant, well-documented contributing factor to the decline of Tang-era Chinese Christianity. But some researchers have questioned whether persecution alone fully explains the community's near-total disappearance from the subsequent historical and archaeological record, particularly given that Buddhism, despite suffering severe damage during the same persecution, ultimately recovered and remained a major, continuous presence in Chinese religious life for the following 12 centuries and beyond, while the Church of the East tradition in China appears to have essentially failed to recover at all, at least not in any form that left a continuous, traceable institutional or textual record connecting the Tang-era community to later periods. Several complicating factors have been proposed to help explain this asymmetry. Some historians point to the Church of the East community's likely much smaller absolute size and narrower social base compared to Buddhism's far more extensive integration across Chinese society by the mid-9th century, meaning the same relative degree of persecution damage would have proven proportionally more devastating and harder to recover from for a smaller, less deeply rooted religious minority. Others have noted the Church of the East's apparent dependence on continued connection to broader Silk Road networks, linking the Chinese community to the tradition's wider institutional structure centered further west, in Persia and Central Asia. A connection that broader political instability across Central Asia in the following centuries, including the disruptions discussed earlier in this investigation, surrounding the Hephthalite collapse's aftermath and the region's subsequent centuries of shifting Turkic and Islamic political control, may have significantly weakened, cutting the small Chinese community off from the kind of sustained external support and clergy replenishment that might have allowed it to rebuild after the Huichang persecution's initial damage. A further, more speculative line of inquiry involves the question of whether small, unrecorded pockets of Church of the East Christian practice or cultural memory may have persisted in China considerably longer than the mainstream historical record suggests, surviving in diminished, localized form beyond the reach of official Tang court documentation, only to fade gradually over subsequent centuries through slow assimilation rather than any single, sharply datable endpoint. Some researchers have pointed to later, considerably fainter references to Christian communities in China during the Yuan Dynasty period, several centuries after the Tang collapse, as potentially suggestive of some degree of continuity, though the connection between these later Mongol-era Christian communities, which arrived through substantially different channels connected to the broader Mongol Empire's own religious diversity, and any genuinely surviving remnant of the earlier Tang-era community remains speculative and difficult to substantiate with confirmed evidence. What remains, then, is a religious community documented with genuine confidence at its height, an imperially sanctioned, centuries-long presence in one of the ancient world's great capital cities, that subsequently vanished so thoroughly from continuous historical memory that its own existence had to be rediscovered centuries later through a stone marker pulled from the ground almost by accident. Did the Huichang persecution alone extinguish a community that Buddhism, facing the same imperial edict, ultimately survived? Or did something quieter, some slower unraveling of connection to the wider Christian world stretching back along the Silk Road, finish what the persecution started, leaving behind nothing but a stele and the unanswered question of how completely a flourishing faith can truly disappear from the memory of the very civilization that once welcomed it in? It's worth pausing again on a pattern this investigation has traced through the Hephthalites, the Cimmerians, and now the vanished Christians of Tang China. How completely a well-documented presence can slip out of continuous memory, requiring rediscovery rather than simple recollection. That same instability, it turns out, touches even the founding legends of great medieval states, including the story of the man credited with founding the very first unified Rus state, whose actual death has never been settled by any source willing to agree with any other. Prince Oleg, known in Old East Slavic sources as Oleg of Novgorod, or sometimes Oleg the Prophet, appears in the primary chronicle, the foundational medieval text for early Rus's history, compiled in Kiev in the early 12th century, describing events that had occurred roughly 2 centuries earlier. According to this chronicle, Oleg ruled as regent or prince over the early Rus state, centered first at Novgorod, and then, following a documented military campaign, at Kiev, which he is credited with capturing around 882 AD, an event the chronicle treats as the effective founding moment of the unified Kievan Rus' state that would dominate the region for the following several centuries. Oleg's reign, as described in the chronicle, included a famous and celebrated military campaign against Constantinople around 907 AD, an event corroborated, at least in general outline, by references in Byzantine sources describing Rus's raiding activity against the Byzantine capital during roughly this period, and by a subsequent trade treaty between the Rus and Byzantium dated to 911 AD, a document whose text the primary chronicle actually preserves, lending genuine documentary weight to at least the broad outline of Oleg's historical existence and activity. What the primary chronicle does not offer with any confidence is a clear, consistent account of how Oleg's life and reign actually ended. The chronicle itself preserves what has become the most famous version of his death, a story with an almost folkloric shape. That Oleg was told by pagan seers or a wise man that he would die from his own horse, prompting him to send the animal away and avoid it for years afterward, only to learn, upon eventually being told the horse had died of old age, that he wished to see its remains one final time, at which point a snake, hidden within the horse's skull, bit him, delivering the fatal wound the prophecy had predicted all along. This account, whatever its narrative appeal, is treated by most modern historians with considerable skepticism as literal historical fact, both because of its clearly legendary, almost folkloric structure, closely paralleling similar death by prophecy motifs found in other medieval and classical literary traditions across Europe and beyond, and because the primary chronicle itself was compiled roughly 2 centuries after Oleg's actual death, drawing on oral tradition, earlier written fragments, and quite possibly deliberate literary embellishment rather than any contemporary eyewitness record of the events it describes. The chronicle's own internal chronology for Oleg's reign has also drawn sustained scholarly scrutiny, with some historians noting apparent inconsistencies and likely conflations between Oleg's own reign and that of his successor Igor, raising broader questions about how reliably the chronicle's account of this entire founding period of Russ's history can be trusted in its specific details, even where its broad outline of state formation is generally accepted. Compounding this uncertainty, other medieval sources offer meaningfully different and not easily reconciled accounts of Oleg's fate. A separate medieval tradition, preserved in a different regional chronicle compiled later and reflecting what appears to be an alternative or supplementary local tradition, places Oleg's death not in Kiev, as the more famous snakebite legend implies, but considerably further north, in Ladoga, in the region of Rus territory closer to Oleg's original power base at Novgorod, suggesting either a genuinely different historical tradition regarding where and how he died, or simply a regional variant reflecting Ladoga's own local claim to connection with the founding figure. A common enough phenomenon in medieval chronicle traditions where multiple regions sought to claim association with the state's celebrated founding figures. Beyond these competing Rus's chronicle traditions, a further complicating source exists in the form of the Schechter letter, a medieval Hebrew document discovered in the Cairo Geniza in the early 20th century, believed to have been written by a Khazar Jewish author, connecting back to the very Khazar tradition already explored earlier in this investigation, describing a Russ's military leader referred to by a name some scholars have connected, with genuine but not universal confidence, to Oleg, engaging in a military campaign against Khazar territory that ended in defeat, followed by an account of this leader fleeing and eventually dying somewhere near or in Persia, an account entirely disconnected from either of the Rus's chronicle traditions and describing a fundamentally different final chapter to Oleg's life altogether, if the identification is accurate. This is where the mystery deepens considerably rather than resolving. If the Schechter letter genuinely refers to the same historical Oleg described in the primary chronicle, it would suggest the celebrated founding narrative of Kievan Rus is preserved in the chronicle tradition, Oleg's triumphant capture of Kiev, his successful campaign against Constantinople, his prophesied death by serpent, may represent a considerably cleaned-up, mythologized version of a career that, according to this alternative source, ended not in triumphant legend, but in military defeat and death far from home. A far less flattering conclusion that later Russ's chroniclers, writing to establish and celebrate their state's founding mythology, may have had genuine institutional motive to omit, alter, or simply never record in the version of events that survived into their own compiled chronicle centuries later. Most historians treat the identification between the Schechter letter's unnamed Rus's commander and the chronicle's Oleg as plausible but genuinely unproven, noting the letter does not use Oleg's name directly, relying instead on titles and circumstantial details that scholars have connected to Oleg through inference rather than explicit textual confirmation. If the identification is wrong, the Schechter letter simply describes a different, otherwise unrecorded, Russ's military leader, and Oleg's fate remains confined to the competing, already internally inconsistent accounts within the Russ's chronicle tradition itself. If the identification is right, it suggests one of medieval Eastern Europe's most celebrated founding figures met an end his own state's later historians found reason to substantially rewrite. There is a further layer of uncertainty worth noting. Connecting back to a pattern this investigation has now traced across numerous ancient and medieval figures, whose own voice never survives independently of later, interested chroniclers. Oleg himself left behind no confirmed text in his own words, no inscription, no letter, nothing beyond the trade treaty preserved second-hand within the primary chronicle itself, meaning every account of his life, his campaigns, and especially his death comes from sources compiled generations after the fact, by chroniclers and scribes with their own institutional, religious, and political reasons for shaping the story of Russ's founding in particular ways, whether toward celebrated legend, regional pride, or, if the Schechter letter identification holds, away from a considerably less triumphant historical reality. What remains, then, is a founding figure whose broad historical existence and significance to early Russ's state formation is not seriously questioned by mainstream historians, anchored by the genuinely corroborating evidence of the 911 Byzantine Treaty, but whose actual death, the where, the how, and even the more basic question of whether the famous snakebite prophecy reflects any genuine historical kernel at all or pure later legend, remains suspended between at least three meaningfully different medieval accounts that were never reconciled by the very civilizations that produced them. Did Oleg die peacefully in his own celebrated capital, victim of an almost mythic irony involving the horse he had spent years avoiding? Did he die further north, in Ladoga, according to a quieter regional tradition history mostly forgot? Or did Kievan Rus's founding hero actually meet his end in distant defeat, his triumphant legend constructed afterward by chroniclers unwilling to let their state's origin story end in anything less than victory? The chronicles that were supposed to settle the question instead left three, and none of them has ever definitively silenced the others. 3 chronicles, 3 deaths, none of them settled. Leave that unresolved tangle behind and travel south now, past the Black Sea and the steppe, down through the Red Sea's narrow waters to the highlands of northern Ethiopia, where this investigation already paused once before, at a guarded chapel said to hold the Ark of the Covenant. That chapel stands in Aksum, once the capital of a kingdom whose written history is even harder to reconstruct than its most famous relic's own contested legend. The kingdom of Aksum emerged as a major regional power beginning around the 1st century AD, eventually becoming one of the most significant trading empires of the ancient world. Its wealth built on control of Red Sea commerce connecting the Mediterranean world, the Arabian Peninsula, and territories further into Africa and the Indian Ocean trade networks beyond. At its height, spanning roughly the 3rd through 6th centuries AD, Aksum controlled territory across parts of modern Ethiopia, Eritrea, and, for a significant period, portions of the southern Arabian Peninsula across the Red Sea as well. A reach substantial enough that the 3rd century Persian prophet Mani reportedly listed Aksum alongside Rome, Persia, and China as one of the 4 great powers of the world in his own era. A striking, independently sourced testament to how seriously contemporary observers outside Africa regarded the kingdom's significance. Aksum's material and epigraphic legacy is genuinely substantial by ancient standards. The kingdom left behind monumental stone stelae, some reaching heights of over 20 meters, among the largest single blocks of stone ever quarried and erected in the ancient world, along with palace ruins, coinage, an independently developed system of writing in the Ge'ez script, and, beginning in the 4th century under King Ezana, some of the earliest surviving inscriptional evidence anywhere in the world for a royal court's official conversion to Christianity, predating similar developments in much of Europe. Ezana's own inscriptions, carved in Ge'ez, Greek, and Sabaic, 3 languages reflecting the kingdom's genuinely cosmopolitan trading connections, survive today, and provide historians with rare, direct royal testimony from a period and region where such first-hand evidence is often entirely absent. And yet, despite this genuinely substantial epigraphic and archaeological record, considerably richer than many other ancient African kingdoms have left behind, Historians researching Aksum face a persistent, frustrating gap regarding the kingdom's broader administrative and literary output, the kind of sustained written record, court chronicles, extended historical narratives, detailed administrative and legal documentation that comparably significant ancient states elsewhere in the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world often preserved in far greater bulk. What survives from Aksum is genuinely significant but also genuinely fragmentary. Royal inscriptions commemorating specific military victories or religious milestones, substantial numbers of coins bearing royal names, and, following Ezana's conversion, Christian symbolism, and archaeological remains of considerable monumental architecture. What does not survive, or has not yet been recovered, is the broader connective tissue, extended administrative archives, court records, the kind of sustained narrative history that would allow historians to reconstruct Aksumite political history with anything approaching the continuity available for, say, Byzantine or Sasanian Persian history during the same general period. Several explanations have been proposed for this gap, none of them mutually exclusive. Environmental factors likely played a significant role, given that any organic writing materials, papyrus, parchment, or other perishable media that Aksumite administrators may have used for day-to-day record-keeping would have faced considerably harsher preservation conditions in Ethiopia's climate than comparable materials preserved in Egypt's exceptionally dry environment, which has famously preserved enormous quantities of ancient papyri that would have disintegrated entirely under different climatic conditions. Under this reading, Aksum may well have maintained a considerably more extensive written administrative culture than currently survives, one lost simply to the ordinary, unglamorous process of organic material decay across many centuries of humid highland climate, rather than reflecting any genuine absence of administrative writing in the first place. A further complicating factor involves Aksum's own gradual political decline and eventual transformation beginning around the 7th century, a period roughly coinciding with the rise of Islam and the resulting shift in regional trade patterns away from routes that had previously flowed heavily through Aksumite-controlled Red Sea ports toward new networks increasingly dominated by expanding Islamic states. This economic and political transition, unfolding over generations rather than through any single dramatic collapse, likely disrupted whatever administrative and court infrastructure had previously existed, with the kingdom's political center gradually shifting further into the Ethiopian highlands in subsequent centuries, a process during which earlier Aksumite records, if they existed in substantial written form at the old capital, may have been lost, dispersed, or simply left behind and eventually destroyed as the political center of gravity moved elsewhere. Ethiopian Orthodox Christian tradition itself offers a further, more specifically pointed complication regarding the kingdom's archives, one connecting directly back to the Ark of the Covenant tradition already explored earlier in this investigation. According to the Kebra Nagast and related Ethiopian traditions, Aksum's royal and religious institutions have, across many centuries, maintained a distinctive practice of restricting access to certain sacred objects and, by extension in some traditions, certain categories of religious and historical documentation, to a narrow circle of designated clergy, a practice most dramatically exemplified by the single guardian monk tradition surrounding the Ark itself. Some historians researching Ethiopian archival history have wondered whether this broader cultural pattern of restricted, guarded access to sacred and historically significant material, well documented in Ethiopia's more recent religious history, may extend backward in some form to Aksumite administrative and religious practice as well, potentially meaning that some portion of the kingdom's written legacy was never intended for broad circulation or copying in the first place, existing instead within restricted ecclesiastical or royal contexts that left it more vulnerable to total loss should those specific custodial lines ever break, compared to documentation that had been more widely copied and circulated during the kingdom's active existence. This remains, admittedly, a more speculative line of interpretation than the environmental and political explanations already discussed, resting on inference from later Ethiopian religious tradition projected backward onto a much earlier period, rather than direct Aksumite-era evidence confirming such restricted archival practices existed in anything like their later, more thoroughly documented form. But it sits alongside a genuinely underexamined question that continues to draw researchers back to Ethiopia's highlands. Whether monastic libraries and archives scattered across the region, some maintained by religious communities with genuinely ancient institutional roots, may still hold undiscovered or uncatalogued manuscript material bearing on Aksum's history, material that has simply never received the kind of systematic modern archival survey that comparable religious manuscript collections elsewhere in the world, particularly in Egypt and the broader Mediterranean, have received over the past century. Ongoing archaeological and manuscript research across Ethiopia and Eritrea continues to add incrementally to the known Aksumite record, and researchers periodically report new inscriptional finds or newly identified manuscript fragments that shed additional light on specific aspects of the kingdom's history. But the broader gap, the absence of the kind of sustained administrative and narrative archive that would let historians trace Aksumite political history with real continuity across its many centuries of documented existence, remains fundamentally unresolved. Somewhere in Ethiopia's monastery libraries, in ground not yet excavated, or simply lost forever to centuries of highland humidity, does the fuller written record of one of antiquity's four great powers, according to at least one contemporary observer beyond its own borders, still wait to be found? Or has it already vanished as completely and as irrecoverably as the organic materials it may once have been written on, leaving only stone, coin, and a handful of royal inscriptions to speak for an empire that Mani himself once considered worthy of Rome's company? Far to the east of wherever our last mystery left us, past mountain ranges and river deltas that have swallowed empires whole, the land begins to flatten. It stretches on, seemingly without end, a sea of grass rolling from the shores of the Black Sea, across the Caucasus, over the Ural Mountains, and into the heart of Siberia. This is the Eurasian steppe, one of the largest continuous grasslands on Earth. And somewhere within its folds, around the 9th century BC, a mystery begins that archaeologists are still struggling to fully explain. It starts, as so many ancient mysteries do, with a mound of earth. In the Republic of Tuva, a remote region of southern Siberia wedged between Mongolia and the Russian Altai, there rises a burial mound known as Arjan. From a distance, it looks unremarkable, a low, grass-covered swell in an otherwise unbroken landscape. But when archaeologists excavated it in the 1970s, and again more thoroughly in the 2000s, they uncovered something that would upend assumptions about one of history's most enigmatic peoples, the Scythians. Inside Arjan lay the remains of a wooden chamber, built like a wheel with spokes radiating outward, containing dozens of burials, human and equine alike. More than 160 horses had been sacrificed and laid to rest alongside their owners, adorned with bronze fittings shaped into coiled predators, snarling beasts, and stylized deer with antlers swept back like flames. The artistry was unmistakable. This was the now famous Scythian animal style, a visual language of power and motion that would come to define nomadic art across the steppe for centuries. The trouble is the date. Radiocarbon analysis placed Arjan at roughly 900 BC, startlingly early, centuries before the Scythians were believed to have emerged as a recognizable culture. For a long time, historians had located the Scythian homeland far to the west, on the plains north of the Black Sea, in what is now Ukraine and southern Russia. That was where Herodotus, the Greek historian writing in the 5th century BC, placed them. That was where classical sources described their wars with the Persians, their skill with the bow, their fearsome reputation as horsemen who could vanish into the horizon before an enemy even understood they'd been attacked. But if Arzan is right, if a fully formed Scythian-style culture, complete with its animal art, its horse burials, and its social hierarchy, existed in Siberia by 900 BC, then the story we thought we knew may have the geography backwards. So which came first? The steppes of the Black Sea or the mountains of Siberia? And if the answer is Siberia, how did a culture born in one of the most remote corners of the ancient world come to dominate a belt of grassland stretching more than 4,000 miles? This is the question historians call the problem of Scythian origins, and it remains even now unresolved. Let's step back to what is agreed upon. By the 7th century BC, a network of related nomadic cultures had emerged across the Eurasian steppe, sharing a strikingly similar set of traits. They rode horses, not just as transport, but as an extension of their military and social identity. They practiced a form of elite burial involving large earthen mounds, or kurgans, often accompanied by sacrificed horses, gold ornamentation, and weapons. And they shared that same distinctive animal-style art: predators locked in combat, deer curled into impossible postures, griffins and wolves rendered with such consistency across thousands of miles that early archaeologists assumed there must have been a single point of origin, a single people who then spread outward. Herodotus offers one version of that spread. He records a story, which he himself treats with some skepticism, that the Scythians originated further east, driven from their homeland by another nomadic group called the Massagetæ, who were in turn pushed by yet another group, in a chain reaction of displacement that rippled across the steppe until the Scythians arrived on the Pontic plains and drove out the Cimmerians who lived there before them. It's a tidy narrative: migration, displacement, conquest. The kind of story that fits neatly into how ancient historians like to explain the movement of peoples. But archaeology rarely cooperates with tidy narratives. The animal-style art found at Arzan doesn't look like a rough, early version of what later appears in the West. It looks fully realized. The techniques are sophisticated. The iconography is consistent. There's no obvious sense of an art form in its infancy, gradually finding its vocabulary before spreading. It simply appears, seemingly complete, in Siberia, centuries before comparable material shows up near the Black Sea. Some researchers have proposed that this means the traditional west-to-east narrative should be reversed entirely, that the Scythian cultural package originated in the Altai-Saiyan region and moved westward, carried along the steppe corridor by successive waves of mounted nomads. Others argue for something messier, that similar cultures arose somewhat independently across the steppe, linked not by a single point of origin but by shared technology, particularly horse domestication, and by the sheer ease of movement the steppe corridor allowed. In this view, the Scythians were never one people at all, but a loose constellation of related groups who came to resemble one another because they lived the same way, rode the same animals, and traded across the same vast, connected landscape. Genetic studies, still ongoing, have complicated the picture further rather than resolving it. Ancient DNA extracted from Scythian-era burials across the steppe shows a patchwork of ancestries. Some populations with strong genetic links to Siberian and East Asian groups, others more closely tied to populations of the Pontic-Caspian steppe and even further west toward the edges of Europe. There is no single uniform Scythian genome. Instead, there's a genetic mosaic that seems to shift gradually as you move across the map, suggesting a long history of intermarriage, absorption, and exchange between groups that were never fully separate and possibly never fully one. And there's another puzzle, harder to quantify, that sits beneath all of this. How did an art style so intricate, so consistent, spread and take hold across a landscape with no cities, no centralized government, no written records of its own? The Scythians left behind no texts explaining their beliefs. Everything we know about their inner world, their concept of the afterlife, their spiritual relationship to the animals they depicted, the meaning behind the endless imagery of predator and prey, comes to us second-hand, filtered through the accounts of outsiders like Herodotus, or inferred from the silent evidence of the graves themselves. Why did they choose these particular animals? The deer, with impossibly long antlers curled over its back, appears again and again, across thousands of miles and centuries of time, almost like a signature. Some scholars see in it a symbol of speed, or of the sun, or of a journey to another world. Others caution against reading too much meaning into imagery, whose original context is lost to us entirely. We are, in a very real sense, trying to reconstruct a belief system from its decorations alone. Then there are the horses. At Arjan, at Pazyryk, further east in the Altai Mountains, and at countless other sites scattered across the steppe, horses were sacrificed in extraordinary numbers to accompany the dead. Some burials contain dozens, a few contain over 100. This was not incidental. It represented a staggering investment of wealth and labor for peoples who, by definition, depended on their herds for survival. What does it mean that a culture would sacrifice such a significant portion of its most valuable resource, again and again, generation after generation, simply to send someone into the afterlife? Fringe theories have, predictably, filled some of these silences. There are those who have speculated about contact between the early Scythian world and cultures far beyond the steppe, pointing to superficial similarities in animal art found as far away as China, or even, more speculatively, gestured toward possible influence from the Near East. Mainstream archaeology treats most of these claims with considerable caution, noting that shared motifs can emerge independently or spread gradually through trade and contact rather than direct migration. Still, the sheer scale of the steppe, the fact that a writer could in principle travel from Mongolia to Ukraine without ever leaving grassland, means that ideas, techniques, and people could have moved further and faster than we might intuitively expect from a Bronze Age or early Iron Age world. What remains is a culture we recognize by its objects, but barely understand in its own terms. We have their gold. We have their horses, preserved by the permafrost of the Altai with startling clarity, tattoos and all. We have Herodotus's second-hand impressions, filtered through Greek eyes that saw the Scythians as both fearsome and other. But we do not have their voice. Perhaps that is the true center of this mystery, not simply where the Scythians began, but the fact that a people capable of producing such intricate, evocative art spread across a landmass larger than most empires, left behind no explanation of themselves at all. Only mounds, only horses, only deer, frozen mid-leap in bronze and gold, running toward a horizon whose meaning was theirs alone to know. A people who left behind their gold, but not their voice. That was the riddle we carried out of the Siberian grasslands. Some 15 centuries later, and thousands of miles to the south, across the highest plateau on Earth, that same riddle returns in stone. The Yarlung Valley sits in the shadow of the Himalayas, in what is now the Tibet Autonomous Region, a place where the air is thin enough to make lowlanders dizzy, and the light has a hard, clarified quality found almost nowhere else on the planet. Scattered across this valley and its surrounding hills are dozens of massive earthen mounds, some over 100 feet high, their sides sculpted into stepped terraces that have eroded, over centuries, into something closer to natural hills than deliberate architecture. To a casual traveler, they might pass unnoticed. To an archaeologist, they represent one of the most tantalizing, unsolved puzzles in the history of Central Asia, the imperial tombs of the Tibetan Empire. Between the 7th and 9th centuries AD, Tibet was not the isolated, contemplative highland kingdom many imagine today. It was a military superpower. Under a line of rulers known as the Senpo, the Tibetan Empire controlled territory stretching from the Tarim Basin in the north to parts of Yunnan in the southeast, and westward toward the borders of Central Asia. Tibetan armies clashed with Tang Dynasty China, at one point even seizing the Chinese capital of Chang'an in 763 AD. This was an empire capable of shaping the geopolitics of an entire continent, and when its emperors died, they were buried in the Yarlung Valley, at a site that came to be known as Chongye, the royal necropolis of a civilization at the height of its power. We know some of their names. Songtsen Gampo, the ruler credited with unifying Tibet and introducing Buddhism to the imperial court, is traditionally said to rest beneath one of the largest mounds. Trisong Detsen, under whose reign Buddhism became firmly established as a state religion, is believed to lie nearby. Tibetan chronicles, composed generations after the empire's collapse and blending historical record with religious narrative, describe elaborate funeral rites, processions, sacrifices, ministers competing for the honor of being buried alongside their emperor, chambers filled with treasure meant to accompany the ruler into the next existence. But here is where the certainty ends and the mystery begins. Not one of these imperial tombs has ever been properly excavated using modern archaeological methods. Centuries of looting, the upheavals following the empire's collapse in the mid-9th century, and the sheer remoteness and political sensitivity of the region have combined to keep the interiors of these mounds almost entirely unknown. We can see their shape from the outside. We can measure their height, estimate their volume, note the faint traces of stepped terracing still visible on their slopes. What lies beneath, the burial chambers themselves, their construction, their contents, even their precise ownership, remains largely a matter of inference, tradition, and educated guesswork. Why does this matter? Because the identification of which mound belongs to which emperor is not settled fact. It is tradition, passed down through religious and historical texts written well after the empire's fall, and cross-referenced only loosely with the physical remains. Some Tibetologists have proposed that certain attributions may be mistaken, that the mound long associated with one ruler might in fact belong to another, or to a queen, or to a minister whose burial was grand enough to be mistaken for royalty in the confusion of later centuries. Without excavation, without inscriptions confirmed in situ, the names carved onto these mounds by tradition remain provisional. Educated belief, not verified fact. Consider, too, what the Tibetan chronicles tell us about the burial practices themselves. Practices that, if accurately recorded, suggest a funerary culture of startling complexity. Some accounts describe the use of elaborate underground chambers, possibly compartmentalized, containing not just the emperor's remains but layers of grave goods: gold, silver, silk, ritual objects. Other traditions speak of surface temples or shrines constructed atop or beside the mounds, meant to serve the spiritual needs of the deceased ruler in perpetuity. Fragments of such structures have indeed been identified near several of the Chongye mounds, lending some credibility to these accounts. But how much of the description is historical memory, and how much is later religious elaboration, shaped by the Buddhist cosmology that came to dominate Tibetan thought after the empire's fall? The chroniclers who wrote these accounts were, in many cases, writing for religious or political purposes of their own, centuries removed from the events they described. There is also the question of what happened to the empire's written records, the ones that might have described the tombs directly, in the words of those who built them. The early Tibetan Empire did leave behind administrative documents, some preserved remarkably well in the dry caves of Dunhuang, far to the north. These fragments give us glimpses of Tibetan bureaucracy, law, and military organization, but detailed contemporary descriptions of the imperial funerary complex itself are strikingly absent, or survive only in fragments too incomplete to reconstruct the full picture. It is as though the empire's greatest architectural and spiritual project, the resting place of its god-kings, existed in a kind of documentary blind spot, described only secondhand, only later, only partially. Why might that be? One explanation is simply the ordinary erosion of history, records lost to fire, to war, to the slow decay of organic materials in a harsh climate, to the empire's own catastrophic fragmentation after 842 AD, when the assassination of the Emperor Langdharma triggered a collapse into feuding regional powers. Empires in collapse rarely preserve their own archives carefully, but others have wondered whether the silence was, at least in part, deliberate, whether the locations, contents, or rites of the imperial tombs were considered sacred knowledge, restricted even in their own time to a narrow circle of priests and officials, and never meant for wider record at all. If so, the mystery may not be an accident of loss, but a structure of secrecy that has simply outlived the civilization that built it. This is where speculation, inevitably, begins to stretch further. Local traditions in the Yarlung Valley speak of protective spirits guarding the royal mounds, of ill fortune befalling those who disturb them, beliefs that, whatever their spiritual truth, have had the very practical effect of discouraging excavation for over 1,000 years. Some modern researchers, working from ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive surveys, have suggested the presence of internal structures within certain mounds, chambers, possibly passageways, though such findings remain preliminary and far from a confirmed map of what lies beneath. Without full excavation, these remain shadows on a screen, not answers. And so the questions accumulate the way sediment does, layer upon layer, over centuries. Do the mounds of Changye actually contain the ruler's tradition assigns to them, or have names and identities drifted across generations of retelling? What became of the treasures the chronicles describe, plundered by looters in the chaos following the empire's collapse, or perhaps never as extensive as later legend suggests? And what, precisely, were the imperial Tibetans trying to preserve or protect by leaving so little written record of the very monuments meant to honor their greatest rulers? Modern Tibetology continues to circle these mounds, quite literally, surveying, measuring, comparing textual traditions against the physical evidence of the terraces and their surrounding ruins. But the tombs themselves, sealed beneath centuries of earth and reverence alike, have not yet been opened to full scientific inquiry. Political sensitivities surrounding the region, combined with genuine respect for sites still considered sacred by many Tibetans today, mean that any resolution to this mystery may be a long way off, if it comes at all. Perhaps that is fitting in its way. An empire that once stretched across the roof of the world, that humbled the Tang court and shaped the religious future of an entire plateau, rests now beneath silent hills that guard their secrets as fiercely as any army once did. The mounds are still there. The names are still spoken. But whether the ground beneath them holds the emperors, history remembers, or a deeper, stranger story waiting to be uncovered, remains, for now, a question only the mountain keeps: wind and the smell of turned earth. Somewhere beneath a hillside in central Italy, a chamber cut into soft volcanic tufa has lain sealed for nearly 3,000 years, and when it is finally opened, The air that escapes carries with it a faint mineral coolness, the scent of stone that has never known sunlight. This is how so many Etruscan tombs have greeted the modern world, not with fanfare, but with a quiet exhalation, as though the earth itself were finally allowed to breathe out a secret it had been holding. The Etruscans built entire cities for their dead. At Cerveteri, north of Rome, the necropolis of Banditaccia spreads across acres of the Italian countryside. Street after street of stone tumuli, some carved with doorways, false windows, even furniture chiseled directly into the rock to mimic the homes the deceased had left behind. Walk through it today and you are, in every meaningful sense, walking through a town. A town built not for the living, but for a civilization's memory of itself. And it is a civilization we still, after more than 2 centuries of serious study, cannot fully explain. By the 8th century BC, a distinct and remarkably sophisticated culture had taken root in the region of Italy known as Etruria, roughly modern Tuscany, western Umbria, and northern Lazio. The Etruscans built some of the earliest true cities in Italy, developed a system of writing, engineered advanced drainage and road networks, and created art of extraordinary technical skill, from the haunting terracotta sculptures of Veii to the delicate bronze mirrors engraved with scenes from a rich and largely lost mythology. Rome itself, in its earliest centuries as a kingdom, appears to have been ruled by Etruscan kings, and much of what would later become distinctly Roman, from the toga to gladiatorial combat to the very practice of augury, reading the will of the gods in the flight of birds, has roots that trace back to Etruscan practice. And yet, for all this influence, for all this material wealth of evidence, one basic question remains stubbornly, famously unresolved. Where did the Etruscans actually come from? It's a question that was already being debated in antiquity. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, offered one answer. The Etruscans, he claimed, originated in Lydia, a kingdom in western Anatolia, and migrated to Italy following a prolonged famine, led by a prince named Tyrrhenus, the same name that gives us the Tyrrhenian Sea, which still washes the coast of Etruria today. It's a vivid story, complete with a named leader and a clear motive. And for centuries, it was taken more or less at face value. But not everyone in antiquity agreed. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing some 4 centuries after Herodotus, rejected the Lydian migration story outright, arguing instead that the Etruscans were indigenous to Italy, a native population who had simply developed their distinctive culture and place, without any foreign migration required. He pointed to what he saw as fundamental differences between Etruscan and Lydian customs, language, and religious practice as evidence against Herodotus's account. So, even in the ancient world, the debate was already split between 2 competing narratives: migration from the east or indigenous development at home. Remarkably, that same split persists today, only now it's being fought not with rival historians quoting each other, but with linguistics, archaeology, and increasingly genetics. Here is where the mystery deepens rather than resolves. The Etruscan language itself is one of the strangest puzzles in European history. Unlike Latin, Greek, or the Celtic and Germanic languages that would come to dominate the continent, Etruscan is not an Indo-European language at all. It belongs to no known language family with any living relatives, standing as what linguists call a linguistic isolate, a tongue that arrived or emerged, seemingly disconnected from the great Indo-European wave that swept across Europe in the millennia before. We can read a fair amount of Etruscan, thanks to the Etruscan alphabet's close relationship to Greek script, and a handful of longer surviving texts, including the remarkable Liber Linteus, an Etruscan religious text preserved by pure accident as linen wrappings on an Egyptian mummy. But reading the words is not the same as fully understanding the people who spoke them, and the language's isolation only deepens the question of origin. If the Etruscans came from Anatolia, why does their language show no clear, undisputed relationship to any Anatolian tongue? And if they were simply native to Italy all along, why does their language stand so apart from the Indo-European languages of their immediate neighbors? Archaeology has offered its own contribution and its own complications. The material culture of early Etruria, the Villanovan culture that preceded and evolved into what we recognize as Etruscan civilization, shows a clear, continuous development from earlier Iron Age Italian cultures. Pottery styles, burial customs, settlement patterns, these evolve gradually, locally, without an obvious break that would suggest a sudden wave of foreign migrants arriving to found a new civilization wholesale. This continuity has led many modern archaeologists to favor the indigenous development model, seeing the Lydian migration as, at best, a partial folk memory of more limited contact and trade with the Eastern Mediterranean, rather than a literal mass migration of an entire people. But then, genetics reopened the question in ways nobody quite expected. Studies of ancient DNA extracted from Etruscan-era burials, published in recent years, have found that the Etruscans were, genetically, remarkably similar to their Latin-speaking Indo-European neighbors, a finding that seems, on its surface, to support the indigenous theory, since it shows no obvious genetic signature of a distinct, large-scale Anatolian migration. And yet, this same genetic evidence deepens rather than resolves the linguistic puzzle. How does a population that is genetically indistinguishable from its Indo-European-speaking neighbors end up speaking a language so fundamentally different from theirs? Shared ancestry, it turns out, does not guarantee a shared tongue, and the Etruscans may represent one of history's clearest examples of language and genetics telling two entirely different stories about the same people. Some researchers have proposed more nuanced models to bridge this gap. Perhaps a smaller, earlier population of non-Indo-European speakers arriving long before the era Herodotus described, perhaps during the Bronze Age or even earlier, settled in the region and were gradually absorbed into the local population, contributing their language while leaving only a faint genetic trace, diluted over dozens of generations. It's a theory that would explain both the linguistic isolation and the genetic continuity. But it remains, for now, a theory, difficult to prove or disprove with the evidence currently available, and dependent on population movements far too ancient and far too gradual to leave the kind of clear signature that scientists could point to with confidence. And so, the question that puzzled Herodotus and Dionysius of Halicarnassus over 2,000 years ago remains, in its essentials, unanswered. Were the Etruscans the descendants of migrants from Anatolia, arriving by sea to found a new civilization on Italian shores? Were they the product of a much older, slower story, a language surviving from a world before the Indo-European migrations reshaped Europe, spoken by a people who were otherwise biologically simply Italian, or does the truth lie somewhere in a more complicated, layered history that neither ancient historian nor modern scientist has yet fully traced? Walk again through the necropolis at Banditacha, past the carved doorways that lead nowhere, past chambers built to mimic homes for people whose language we can read, but whose deepest origins we cannot confirm. The Etruscans left behind cities of stone, art of extraordinary skill, and a writing system we can sound out letter by letter. And still somehow, they have not told us where they came from. Perhaps the answer is written somewhere we haven't yet learned to look. Or perhaps, like so much of what the Etruscans built for their dead, it was always meant to remain just out of reach. That same sea which gave the Etruscans their name, the Tyrrhenian, is a modest body of water by comparison to what comes next. Leave the Mediterranean behind entirely, cross two continents and stand instead at the edge of the largest ocean on Earth. The Pacific spans nearly a third of the planet's surface, an expanse so vast that Europe, Asia, and Africa combined could be dropped into it and still leave room to spare. And scattered across this immensity, thousands of miles from the nearest continent and often thousands of miles from each other, lie tiny islands, specks of land that, against every reasonable expectation, human beings found, settled, and thrived upon centuries before anyone in the Mediterranean world had mapped the shape of their own coastlines with any real precision. This is the world of Polynesia, and the mystery of how it came to be inhabited remains one of the most remarkable open questions in the history of human exploration. Consider the scale of what had to happen. Easter Island, Rapa Nui as its inhabitants call it, sits over 1,100 miles from the nearest inhabited land, and more than 2,000 miles from South America. Hawaii lies roughly 2,400 miles from California, and even further from any other Polynesian island chain. New Zealand, the southernmost point of what researchers call the Polynesian Triangle, sits thousands of miles from the tropical islands where Polynesian culture first took shape. And yet by roughly 1000 AD, with some islands settled earlier and others considerably later, the exact chronology still debated, nearly every habitable island within this vast triangle had been found, settled, and incorporated into a shared cultural and linguistic world stretching across a tenth of the Earth's surface. How? That is the question that has driven more than a century of archaeological investigation, and it remains, in crucial respects, unresolved. The mainstream account, supported by an increasingly rich body of linguistic, archaeological, and genetic evidence, traces Polynesian origins back to Taiwan and the broader Austronesian expansion that began there roughly 5,000 years ago. Over the following millennia, Austronesian-speaking peoples moved south and east through the Philippines and Indonesia, eventually reaching the Bismarck Archipelago near New Guinea, where a distinctive culture emerged around 1500 BC, identified archaeologically by a particular style of pottery known as lapita, decorated with intricate geometric stamped designs. The Lapita people pushed further east into Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa, and it was here, over the following centuries, that a distinctly Polynesian culture and language began to crystallize. From this western Polynesian homeland, voyagers eventually pushed outward into the remote Pacific, first to the Marquesas and Society Islands, and from there, in a series of increasingly extraordinary journeys, to Hawaii in the north, Rapa Nui in the southeast, and New Zealand in the south. Each leg of this expansion required crossing open ocean for thousands of miles, navigating without instruments, without written charts, and without any certain knowledge that land existed at the far end of the voyage. This is where the mystery deepens from a question of where to a question of how, and it's a question that has been debated fiercely for the better part of a century. For decades, one theory held that this vast expansion happened primarily through accidental drift voyages, canoes blown off course by storms, fishermen carried out to sea, and eventually washed ashore on distant islands by sheer chance, gradually seeding the Pacific through a long, unplanned series of happy accidents. It's an explanation with a certain appeal in its simplicity, but it struggles to account for the evidence of clearly deliberate, two-way voyaging embedded in Polynesian oral traditions, which describe named navigators, planned expeditions, and return journeys between distant island groups. Traditions that many researchers now believe preserve genuine historical memory, not merely myth. The strongest challenge to the drift voyage theory came from a remarkable piece of experimental archaeology. In 1976, a reconstructed double-hulled voyaging canoe named Hokulea sailed from Hawaii to Tahiti, a distance of over 2,500 miles, using only traditional wayfinding techniques. reading the position of stars, the direction and character of ocean swells, the flight patterns of birds, and subtle shifts in cloud formation that can indicate land beyond the horizon. The voyage succeeded, guided by master navigator Mao Piailug, whose knowledge came from the Micronesian island of Satawal, one of the last places on Earth where this ancient wayfinding tradition had survived unbroken into the 20th century. Hokulea demonstrated, beyond reasonable doubt, that deliberate navigated voyaging across thousands of miles of open Pacific was entirely achievable, using only the tools and knowledge available to ancient Polynesians. The question was no longer whether such journeys were possible. It was how precisely this navigational knowledge had developed, and how it managed to persist and spread across such an enormous and fragmented cultural landscape. But even settling the how of the voyaging itself leaves other threads of this mystery unresolved. Chief among them, the strange, persistent presence of the sweet potato. The sweet potato is native to South America, and yet archaeological and linguistic evidence places it firmly in Polynesia well before European contact. Carbonized sweet potato remains have been found in the Cook Islands dating to around 1000 AD, and the word for sweet potato across numerous Polynesian languages shows striking similarities to kumara and related terms used by indigenous peoples along the Andean coast of South America. This has led to one of the most debated questions in Pacific archaeology. Did Polynesian voyagers reach South America, obtain the sweet potato, and carry it back across thousands of miles of open ocean? Or did the sweet potato spread by some other means entirely? Carried by ocean currents, perhaps, or through a South American voyage into the Pacific that left no other clear trace? The Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl famously argued, in the mid-20th century, for an even more sweeping theory, that Polynesia had been settled not from the west, from Asia, but from the east, from South America, with the Kon-Tiki raft voyage of 1947 intended to demonstrate that such a crossing was physically possible. Heyerdahl's raft did successfully drift from Peru to the Tuamotu Islands, proving the voyage was feasible. But the overwhelming weight of linguistic, archaeological, and genetic evidence gathered in the decades since has firmly supported the Asian, Austronesian origin of Polynesian peoples, not a South American one. And yet the sweet potato remains, a small, stubborn, living puzzle, suggesting that whatever the primary direction of settlement, some form of contact between Polynesia and South America likely did occur at some point, through means and circumstances that remain frustratingly unclear. There are other lingering questions, too, less resolved than the broad outline might suggest. The precise timing of the most distant voyages, to Hawaii, to Rapa Nui, to New Zealand, remains a subject of ongoing revision as radiocarbon dating techniques improve, with some earlier estimates for initial settlement now considered too early, and the true chronology still being refined. Genetic studies of Rapa Nui populations have found DNA sequences suggesting South American contact remarkably early, possibly as early as the 13th century, findings that remain debated, and that some researchers caution may reflect more recent, post-European mixing rather than ancient contact. Each new study seems to sharpen certain edges of this picture while leaving others just as blurred as before. What remains beyond dispute is the achievement itself. Somewhere in the deep Pacific night, with no compass, no chart, no instrument beyond the accumulated knowledge held in memory, and passed from navigator to apprentice, human beings crossed thousands of miles of open, uncharted ocean, again and again, and found, impossibly small, impossibly distant, the exact islands they were seeking. They did this while much of the so-called ancient world still hugged its own coastlines. How much of this extraordinary navigational knowledge has already been lost, quietly, over the centuries between the last great voyages and the moment modern researchers began asking these questions. How many islands were found, and perhaps briefly touched, and then deliberately left unsettled for reasons no oral tradition preserved? And what, precisely, passed between the shores of Polynesia and the coast of South America? In an encounter ancient enough to leave a sweet potato in the soil but too faint, so far, to leave anything else we can clearly read. Out on the ocean, where the horizon offers no landmarks and the stars are the only fixed points in an otherwise featureless world, the full answer may be waiting still. Centuries before Hokulea ever cut through Pacific swells, and half a world away from any ocean at all, a different kind of navigation was underway. Not across water, but across the deserts and river valleys of Central Asia, where merchants, scholars, and soldiers moved along the arteries of the Silk Road, carrying with them one of the most coveted currencies of the medieval world, silver struck in the mints of Bukhara and Samarkand. Today, those coins turn up in the strangest of places. Buried hoards containing thousands of Samanid dirhams have been unearthed not only across Central Asia, but as far north as Scandinavia, in Sweden, Finland, and along the river systems of Russia, carried there by Viking traders who moved silver southward and eastward in exchange for furs, amber, and slaves. It is a strange thing to stand in a museum in Stockholm and look at a coin struck 1,000 years ago in a city that today sits in modern Uzbekistan, thousands of miles away, and to realize that this small disk of silver once passed through hands that spoke languages, worshipped gods, and imagined worlds entirely unknown to each other, connected only by the quiet, relentless logic of trade. These coins are, in a very real sense, the visible remnant of one of the wealthiest states of the medieval Islamic world, the Samanid Emirate, which ruled over much of Central Asia and parts of eastern Iran from the 9th to the late 10th century AD. And it is the deeper fate of that wealth, vast beyond what the surviving coin hoards alone can account for, that forms one of Central Asia's most enduring, least known mysteries. The Samanids ruled from two great cities, Bukhara and Samarkand, which under their patronage became centers of extraordinary intellectual and artistic achievement. This was a court that supported the physician and philosopher Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, whose medical writings would shape both Islamic and European scholarship for centuries. It was a dynasty that revitalized the Persian language as a vehicle for poetry and scholarship after centuries of Arabic dominance following the Islamic conquests, helping to lay the groundwork for a Persian literary renaissance that would eventually produce figures like Ferdowsi, author of the great national epic, the Shahnameh. And it was, above all, an economic powerhouse, controlling critical stretches of the Silk Road, taxing the flow of goods between China, India, the Islamic world, and ultimately Europe, and operating silver mines in the mountains of what is now Tajikistan and Uzbekistan that were, by the standards of the age, extraordinarily productive. The scale of Samanid silver output was immense enough to fund not just a lavish court, but an entire monetary system that reshaped trade networks across half the medieval world. Millions of Samanid dirhams entered circulation over the course of the dynasty's roughly 130 years of rule. And this is where the first thread of the mystery begins to surface. Historical chronicles from the period, along with the accounts of later medieval historians describing the Samanid court, speak of treasuries in Bukhara containing wealth on a scale that seems almost impossible to reconcile with the archaeological record we've recovered so far. Gold, jewels, precious textiles, and vast quantities of silver beyond even what circulated as coinage are described as having filled the Emirate's treasury at its height. Yet, when the Samanid state finally collapsed at the very end of the 10th century, conquered by the Karakhanids from the north, and the Ghaznavids from the south, in a squeeze that ended over a century of Samanid rule within the space of just a few years. The historical record grows strangely quiet on the question of where, precisely, this treasury ended up. Some of it was certainly captured by the conquering powers. That much is consistent with how such transitions of power typically unfolded across the medieval Islamic world. Some was surely absorbed into ongoing trade, spent, melted down, restruck under new rulers with new names and new inscriptions, the silver itself indifferent to which dynasty claimed it. This is, in fact, the most widely accepted explanation among historians, that there was no single lost treasure at all, simply a gradual, unglamorous dispersal of wealth through conquest, taxation, and the ordinary churn of a medieval economy in transition. But the sheer scale of the discrepancy between what the chronicles describe and what has actually been recovered, even accounting for everything absorbed into later economies, has left some historians and treasure hunters alike wondering whether a portion of that final Samanid treasury was never dispersed at all, whether some portion of it was hidden deliberately in the chaotic final years of the dynasty's collapse, perhaps by court officials or members of the royal family, hoping to preserve at least some of the emirate's wealth against a conquest they could see coming, but were powerless to stop. Bukhara itself offers a tantalizing physical setting for such speculation. The city sits atop centuries of continuous habitation, its foundations layered with the remains of earlier eras, honeycombed with old cisterns, foundations, and passages, many still unmapped in any systematic way. The Ark of Bukhara, the ancient citadel that served as the seat of Samanid power, has been built, destroyed, and rebuilt multiple times across the centuries, each reconstruction potentially burying or disturbing whatever lay beneath the version that came before. Local traditions in the region, as in so many places with a similarly layered history, include stories of hidden chambers and buried wealth beneath the old citadel. Stories impossible to verify, but persistent enough that they surface again in each generation's retelling. Modern archaeology has approached these questions with considerably more caution than local legend allows. Systematic excavation beneath a living, continuously inhabited city like Bukhara is an enormously complex undertaking, complicated by the practical realities of modern urban life layered atop a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and by the simple fact that most of what could be excavated without disturbing the modern city has, over the past century, already been examined. No definitive lost treasury has been found. But the coin hoards keep surfacing, unpredictably, decades and centuries after the dynasty that minted them disappeared. A farmer's plow striking a buried jar in a field outside Samarkand. A construction project in Russia, unearthing a cache buried by some long-forgotten Viking trader who never returned to reclaim it. Each discovery is a small physical reminder that an enormous amount of Samanid silver simply went into the ground at some point, for reasons we can only guess at, and in many cases was never retrieved by whoever buried it. Why does silver get buried and left across so many centuries and so many cultures? Sometimes it's fear, wealth hidden in advance of war or raid, with the owner intending to return once danger passed, and simply never making it back. Sometimes it's ritual, or a form of long-term saving in societies without the equivalent of a modern bank. And sometimes the reasons are simply lost entirely, along with the person who dug the hole in the first place. The Samanid hoards, found scattered from Scandinavia to Central Asia, likely represent all of these motives at once, tangled together across a century and a half of trade, conquest, and quiet human decision-making that left no written explanation behind. Was there ever a single, concentrated, lost treasure of the Samanid emirs, hidden in the final desperate years of the dynasty's collapse and never recovered? Or is the truth simply broader and less cinematic? A vast wealth scattered gradually across an entire continent through the ordinary mechanics of trade, tribute, and conquest, with each individual coin hoard representing its own small private story rather than fragments of one grand hidden fortune. Beneath the streets of Bukhara, where century has been built upon century with barely a pause, something may yet remain unaccounted for. Or perhaps the true treasure was never a single hoard at all, but the silver road itself, scattered, coin by coin, across half the medieval world, waiting quietly in the ground for someone, somewhere, to turn the right patch of earth. Stone, laid without mortar, fitted together with such precision that not even a blade could slip between the joints. That was the silent craftsmanship buried beneath Bukhara's shifting earth. Follow that same idea of stone fitted to stone, southward now, across an entire continent, to a hilltop in the highlands of southern Africa, where walls of gray granite rise in sweeping, curved lines through the bush, built the very same way, dry stacked, without mortar, and standing after nearly 1,000 years with barely a stone out of place. This is Great Zimbabwe. Its outer wall, part of what is known today as the Great Enclosure, stretches over 800 feet in circumference, rising in places to more than 30 feet high, constructed from an estimated 1 million granite blocks, each shaped and fitted by hand from stone quarried from the surrounding hills. Within and around this enclosure lie the remains of an entire city, the hill complex perched dramatically atop a rocky outcrop, the valley complex spreading across the lower ground, and the connecting walls, passages, and platforms of what was, at its height between roughly 1100 and 1450 AD, one of the largest and most sophisticated urban centers in sub-Saharan Africa. Estimates of the city's peak population range as high as 18,000 people, making it comparable in scale to many contemporary cities across medieval Europe. Great Zimbabwe was not an isolated curiosity. Archaeological evidence, imported glass beads, Chinese porcelain, pieces of Persian pottery, confirms it stood at the center of an extensive trade network, connected via the Swahili coast to the wider Indian Ocean world, exchanging gold and ivory from the African interior for luxury goods arriving from as far away as China. This was a city that understood, and actively participated in, one of the great commercial arteries of the medieval world. And yet, when European explorers, missionaries, and colonial administrators began encountering these ruins in the late 19th century, the question that dominated Western discussion for the better part of a century was not how this remarkable city had functioned, or what its rise and fall could tell us about African history. It was, astonishingly, whether Africans had built it at all. This is where the mystery of Great Zimbabwe takes on a character quite different from the others we've explored, because here, the central unknown was manufactured, deliberately and persistently, in service of a colonial narrative that found it more convenient to deny African achievement than to reckon with it. Early European visitors to the site, arriving under the influence of Cecil Rhodes's colonial enterprises in the 1890s, encountered walls of such scale and sophistication that many simply refused to believe local Shona populations or their ancestors could have built them. Theories multiplied rapidly, each reaching outward for some foreign origin. Phoenician traders, the biblical Queen of Sheba, Arab merchants, even lost tribes of Israel were all proposed, at various points, as the true builders of Great Zimbabwe. Explanations that had far more to do with the racial assumptions of colonial-era archaeology than with any actual evidence found at the site itself. The most persistent of these theories centered on the Phoenicians, ancient seafaring traders from the eastern Mediterranean, or their descendants, who some speculated might have established trading colonies deep in the African interior in search of gold, leaving behind Great Zimbabwe as evidence of their presence. This theory found a particularly influential champion in Richard Nicklin Hall, a journalist and amateur archaeologist appointed to oversee the site in 1902, who wrote extensively about the ruins while systematically clearing away what he dismissed as later unimportant occupation layers. Layers that tragically contained crucial archaeological evidence of the very Shona ancestral occupation that would have definitively answered the question of who built Great Zimbabwe, decades before scientific consensus was finally forced to acknowledge it. Because the answer, once proper archaeological method was finally applied, was never actually in serious doubt. Careful excavation by researchers including David Randall McIver in the early 20th century, and more definitively by Gertrude Caton Thompson in the 1920s, found no credible evidence of any foreign origin whatsoever. Pottery styles, construction techniques, and the layout of the settlement all showed clear, unbroken continuity with the Iron Age cultures of the surrounding region, part of a broader tradition of dry stone building found at hundreds of related, smaller sites scattered across Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and South Africa, a tradition local to the Shona people and their ancestors, developed and refined entirely within Africa. Radiocarbon dating, developed decades later, only confirmed what the archaeological evidence had already made clear. Great Zimbabwe was built, occupied, and eventually abandoned entirely by African hands, part of the Shona-speaking Karanga culture's own indigenous political and economic development. And yet, remarkably, the colonial government of Rhodesia continued to suppress and censor this conclusion for decades after it was scientifically established, actively discouraging museum curators and researchers from stating plainly that Great Zimbabwe was of African origin, precisely because such an admission complicated the ideological justifications underpinning white minority rule in the region. It was only after Zimbabwean independence in 1980, with the new nation taking its very name from these ruins, that the site's African origins could be discussed openly and without institutional interference, a reclamation both scholarly and deeply symbolic. So in this case, the mystery of who built Great Zimbabwe has a clear, well-evidenced answer. The ancestors of the Shona people, developing sophisticated architectural and urban traditions entirely within the African continent. But settling that question has only made room for other, genuinely open ones to surface. Questions less about denial, and more about the texture of a history still being reconstructed. What, precisely, caused Great Zimbabwe's decline and eventual abandonment sometime in the 15th century, after roughly 3 centuries as a major regional power? Some researchers point to environmental factors. Soil exhaustion from supporting a population of thousands, or a shift in regional climate patterns affecting agriculture and grazing. Others point to shifting trade routes, as gold and ivory networks gradually reoriented toward emerging centers of power further north. Oral traditions among Shona descendants offer their own layered explanations, blending historical memory with cultural narrative in ways that resist easy translation into the language of Western archaeological cause and effect. The precise mechanics of the city's decline, whether sudden or gradual, driven primarily by environment, economics, political fragmentation, or some combination of all three, remain genuinely debated among historians and archaeologists studying the site today. There is also the deeper question of what was lost in those early decades of colonial mismanagement. The layers Hall cleared away in his eagerness to find evidence of foreign builders who never existed. The artifacts removed or misplaced before proper documentation. The oral histories that might have been recorded from Shona elders in the late 19th century but instead went unasked. Dismissed as irrelevant to a colonial project already certain it knew the answer it wanted to find. Great Zimbabwe's greatest mystery, in the end, may not be a question the stones themselves ever posed. It may be the question of how much genuine historical knowledge was quietly erased by those who came looking for an answer they had already decided upon before they arrived. Stand today within the curved granite walls of the great enclosure, and it is not hard to sense both things at once. the extraordinary skill of the builders who raised these walls without mortar. Stone fitted to stone with a precision that has outlasted the very empire that once tried to deny their existence, and the quieter, harder to recover history of everything that was overlooked, dismissed, or deliberately buried along the way. The walls remain. What else might still be waiting in the layers beneath them for someone willing to look without an answer already in hand?